I grew up an only child, just me and my mom. She had me at an early age, 19.
In the 1980s, Monty Smith is an only child, growing up in Okmulgee, Oklahoma. His dad is not present in his life, so his mom is everything to Monty.
She was about 5'1", little woman, but she was spicy. Straight to the point with me. She's like, I'm not gonna let you grow up be a bad kid. I'm gonna be telling you what's right and wrong. She was good at that.
He was very close to his mom. That was his rock. I have childhood memories of Monty and I, playing in the backyard while our mothers were inside, doing their thing.
Monty's mother is in ill health for most of his childhood with kidney disease.
My mom was on dialysis for my whole life. 3 days a week, we had to go to the hospital, and for 8 hours of time for her to do dialysis. She was a very strong woman, though. She still, was able to hold a job down, too.
He was going to school. He was at home, making sure his mom had what she needed or they needed. He definitely had to grow up a lot faster than the rest of us.
Whenever Monty gets the chance, he heads to the basketball court with his best friend, Jermaine.
Basketball was a big thing, so we played basketball nonstop. Everybody wanted to be the star player, the most popular.
We always had a ball in our hand. For Monty, it was strictly basketball. He was a very good basketball player.
After graduating from high school, Monty attends college, but he and Jermaine still have time to play ball. This is how they meet Monty's first love, Tabitha Lynch, in 1993.
Tabitha and Monty grew close very quickly. The way that they looked at each other, I could tell that was his first love.
We were a magnet towards each other. I did kind of feel like I, was a lucky guy because we just always had a good time together no matter what we did. There was never any arguing, just had fun all the time.
After dating for 3 years, Monty and Tabitha eventually drift apart.
She was in college playing basketball, and so was I. She was at a different school, so we didn't get to see each other a lot.
I know life happens, but I would have definitely liked to have seen them stay together back in those days. That was definitely the one that got away from Monty.
After college, Monty becomes a mechanic and gets married. But 10 years later, as his mother's health deteriorates, so too does his marriage.
Monty, of course, wanted to be around his mother more, definitely played a role in his relationship with his wife.
After me and my wife had split up, my mother had a stroke. And then there was, just her health just went quickly.
It took a rough toll, and it took a toll on him mentally.
But the day that I found out that she passed, I was on a motorcycle ride out of town. That was a hard moment, and I was crying inside my helmet. Yeah, I felt empty after my mom's gone, I was just trying to get through one day at a time and hide my emotions from everybody, I worked as much as I could. I developed this new passion for motorcycles. So I just, get on my bike and ride when I could. That was my escape.
On Halloween night in 2010, Monty's life begins looking up when he attends a party at a local club.
So we walk in, there was a lot of good costumes there. I was standing there and someone just kind of grabbed me by my shirt, and before I can get a chance to see what was happening, I was being pulled onto the dance floor, and then never even faced me. She's just looking the other way and dancing with me. I didn't know what to think about her at first. I was like, that's kind of aggressive approach right there. So then that song was over, and I walked over to the stand by the bar area, and then she came with me. I said, my name's Monty. And she said, oh, my name's Shayna.
Shayna Sims is a 22-year-old hairstylist.
She was about the same height as me, and that's kind of tall for a woman. She had dark hair, pretty face. They just kept talking. She stayed by my side for the rest of the night. That was a nice feeling to have a pretty girl like that interested in me, because I was kind of feeling down on myself a little bit, right before that happened. We went back to her house. I spent the night there with her the first night, just talking and hanging out till the sun came up.
The relationship moves quickly, and a few months later, in January 2011, they move in together.
It was never a dull moment, I'll say that. We had fun, did a lot of things together.
I remember him being excited when he told me that he had met Shayna and how he lit up when he talked about Shayna originally.
The next thing I know, we started talking about, well, maybe we should get married.
Just a few weeks later, Monty surprises Shayna with a ring.
So we're at dinner. I waited for the right moment, and then I got down on one knee. I asked her, to marry me, and she said yes. I put the ring on her finger. She just was very excited and happy.
He was all in on this relationship, and this is what he wanted. She seemed to be feeling the same way, so I was very supportive.
We had decided to get married at the Tulsa Historical Society. She did all the prep work herself, which I was kind of amazed by that. I was really nervous, but from the moment that I seen her come out and I seen that smile on her face, it felt right. Everybody was encouraging to us. It was a great day.
He wanted to be the husband and the father and the family man that he never had. So he very much looked forward to that.
I had came home from work one day and she had this smile on her face. And I'm like, what are you smiling about? So I think I remember her saying, come here, I want to show you something. So she showed me the pregnancy test. It showed positive and I felt happy, excited to be a dad.
As an expectant father, Monty is fully invested in Shayna having a healthy pregnancy. So he is surprised and concerned one day when he becomes aware of a potential problem.
We had a doctor's appointment, just normal routine. The doctors came into the room and told us they did not support my mother taking pain medication during pregnancy.
Shayna, who had been complaining of leg pain, has been self-medicating for months with Percocet and Lortabs, both highly addictive opioids.
She went to a pain specialist doctor, and I was unaware of this. So I was at work at this time, so I'm pretty sure that she did not tell them that she was pregnant, and they proceeded to help her with her pain level.
Her obstetrician has become aware of Shayna's drug use through routine lab tests.
They could not help her anymore, that she needed to look for another doctor to help deliver her baby. I was furious. I can't believe that you could endanger your child like that. I found the medication in her purse, confronted her. I said, you're not taking any more of these right now because I'm taking them from you. So you can't have these anymore.
Monty's daughter is born 6 months later.
She came out, she heard my voice and stopped crying and opened her eyes and looked for me. At that moment, our bond was created. She's healthy, no problems whatsoever. I was very happy about that, and that the things that her mom had done early on did not affect her. Shayna seemed happy to be a new mom again to this pretty little girl. At that point, we had a good relationship pretty much. After my daughter was just a few months old, I switched to night shift on my job. So 3 in the evenings till midnight, working hard to provide as much as I can for my family since I'm the only one working right now.
While Monty works, he believes his baby daughter is tucked safely in bed during his shift. But he is wrong. I
would come home at midnight. I would notice that she's just getting home right when I am and bringing my daughter in the house, out of the car seat. She hadn't been home all evening long. She just said, I'm out running errands. It's okay. She said, I don't see anything wrong with that. I told her that she shouldn't be out with my daughter all evening long, that she needed to be home in the bed. I started to become more aggravated. We had a lot of arguments.
One night, Monty arrives home to find Shayna in bed, although she's not quite alone.
She's passed out. Her phone is laying face up on the bed and is on FaceTime with some other young man that I do not know. Couldn't believe it.
And I started seeing the signs from Shayna that maybe she wasn't the person that she's seeming to be. She became very evil very quickly.
Monty Smith has just found his wife Shayna in bed and on FaceTime with another man.
I look at the phone, she's passed out, unaware that I'm even right there looking at her phone. No clue. A lot of things went through my mind. But number one was, how could you? My daughter's right there in the other room. The next day, I brought it up and talked to her about it. And she said, well, I don't remember that. Denial.
Monty did mention a lot that Shayna would just lie about nothing, lie to be lying.
I was pretty upset, pretty angry. At this point, the trust is gone.
When I hear these things myself, I'm thinking, Monty, you got to do something about this before it gets worse.
And indeed, things do get worse.
One day we have an argument. She's, not letting me go out the door. I said, I have to go to work. Excuse me, move out of my way. And then she says, you're not going to touch me. If you do, you're going to go to jail. And I said, what do you mean by that?
This is when Shayna reveals just how low she will sink to get her own way.
She's like, well, because you're black. And they're going to take you to jail before they would me. After her saying that to me, I was really, really done. And I wanted to just leave.
They do have a daughter together. That was the main reason for Monty wanting to stay. He wanted to not have a broken home. So he made his decisions to stay.
Soon, Shayna's erratic behavior escalates outside the home.
Monty had taken Shayna to go tan. He stayed outside in the car with the baby.
Unbeknownst to Monty, while inside, Shayna overreacts to something trivial and flies off the handle.
While he was sitting in the car with the baby, 2 police cars pulled up outside the tanning salon. He said, hey man, I think something's happening. And yeah, she was having a scene inside the tanning salon, ended up, cursing out some ladies that worked there and may call the cops. And, they eventually, kicked her out. It was at that point, I told him, I said, hey man, I love you, brother, but you need to figure this out.
I had friends that I had confided in about my problems at home. They just kind of let me know how messed up the situation was that I was in and what am I going to do next.
Around November 2014, an ex-girlfriend reaches out to Monty on social media. Her name is Christina Perez.
We had said hello to each other on Facebook. I think she may have asked, what my situation was and probably told her, I was unhappy.
Monty and Christina do not meet in person, but continue to chat occasionally online until Shayna finds out.
So I came home from work one day and Shayna asked me who this Christina girl was, and I was like, oh gosh, here we go.
Shayna thought that Christina was the enemy and was trying to take her man.
She was mad about this situation that she thought was going on. So I am accused of having an affair with Christina.
The situation escalates when Shayna tracks down Christina's home and her place of work.
She's showing up at Christina's job, sitting outside, and it's getting more and more aggressive, their tone every day.
And then it blew up from there.
One day when I got home from work, they were talking to each other, and I could hear Christina on speakerphone saying, "I know what you did to my car, and I'm calling the police." Shayna had slashed Christina's tires. I mean, I'm blown away. I'm thinking to myself, who is this person?
She was slashing this woman's tires. She was following this woman. She was doing all these crazy things to this woman who had dated her husband 5 years ago.
I couldn't believe it. It first started out, with Shayna acting out in public and then escalating to slashing someone's tires. What's next? At that point, I knew that Shayna was crazy.
After the tire slashing, it's just getting worse and worse each day. They're making threats towards each other at this point.
Christina doesn't retaliate, and Monty stops contacting her. But things come to a head when Shayna decides to file a protective order against Christina.
We go to the courthouse. I'm with her, me and my daughter. We're sitting in the lobby just waiting. I looked down the hallway and saw Christina.
By chance, Christina is at the courthouse as well to file a protective order against Shayna.
And of course, they gave each other mean looks. And the next thing I know, they're walking towards each other. And my wife is holding my daughter. And they wanted to exchange words with each other. And then they swung at each other. As soon as they throw punches at each other, I'm grabbing my daughter out of harm's way. My daughter's crying. It was quite intense. The deputies came out and separated everybody. They took them back in the holding areas until they figure out what happened.
And thank goodness there was tape. So the deputies pull it, and of course they see Christina is innocent, that Shayna has purposefully knocked into this woman and then starts screaming about Christina attacking her.
They realized that the child had been endangered in this encounter. So my wife was charged with child endangerment.
Shayna is put on probation for a year, and Christina is granted a protective order against her.
I did feel trapped in this, I'm not gonna call it a marriage anymore. I felt trapped in this situation. But because my daughter's involved in this, and I can't just take off.
Monty doesn't hear from Christina again. Meantime, out of the blue, a few months later, Monty gets a message from another girlfriend from his past, Tabitha Lynch, his first love.
She had contacted me through Facebook and said, "Hey, how's it going?" We chatted a little bit and then exchanged a number to talk. Her contacting me was kind of like a breath of fresh air. It was nice to hear from her and, see how she was doing in her life.
It's been over 20 years since Monty and Tabitha dated each other. Tabitha is divorced with 2 children of her own.
I didn't know all the details going on in her life at this time, but she just, told me that she had kids and they were doing good. And once she found out that I was having problems with my wife, she's like, "I'd like to reach out to her and talk to her." I just didn't think it was a good idea. I didn't know what to expect from Shayna. I was like, "No, it's okay. I got this under control. I'm gonna handle it my way." But one day after returning home from work, I walked to the door and Shayna was upset. She's like, "Tabitha has reached out to me and said that you and her have been talking and that I'm a terrible mom and a terrible wife." And so she asked me, "Who's this bitch?"
Shayna was very angry because she felt that Tabitha was a threat.
She can't stop victimizing people. I would say she is one of the most bizarre people I've ever covered in 31 years of covering crime.
Shayna was very jealous, very vindictive, very evil.
Shayna Smith is enraged when she receives a warning message from her husband Monty's former girlfriend, Tabitha Lynch.
Tabitha did send a message to Shayna, basically telling her that, she's losing the best thing that she could ever have, and she needs to change her ways before she screws it up.
Shayna took that as disrespect and did not like what she heard because it's coming from another woman. And she asked me, are y'all messing around? And I said, no.
Shayna is determined to have it out with Tabitha face to face, but she can't seem to locate her.
She's constantly asking me where to find her at. I said, I don't know. I was kind of worried about these two women having the interaction with each other because I don't know what Shayna's capable of.
But Shayna never gets the chance to confront Tabitha because one day, Tabitha suddenly becomes critically ill.
Tabitha had started having some health issues, and eventually she went into the hospital and didn't make it out.
2 months after reconnecting with Monty, Tabitha dies unexpectedly from natural causes.
Tabitha was like a sister to me, so it hurt me deeply.
I was like, I can't believe it. It seemed like I just talked to her just the other day and everything was fine.
Monty consoles himself that at least she's out of harm's way from Shayna.
I told Shayna that Tabitha passed away. She acted cold and heartless. She didn't care. The next words out of her mouth were, well, good. That's what that bitch gets. My jaw hit the floor. I couldn't believe it. I just heard her say that about Tabitha's death. I was already emotionally removed. I was ready to be physically removed. I didn't want to know her anymore.
The viewing for Tabitha Lynch is held in April of 2015 at a funeral chapel in East Tulsa.
I was there Thursday afternoon, probably between 1 and 2 o'clock. It hurt my heart. It was like a member of my family had passed away.
As the viewing ends, the family is taking a break outside when a stranger slips inside, presumably to pay her last respects.
Tabitha's mother happens to see this woman who looks like she's going and actually reaching into the casket. Something seems odd. It's reported to other family members. That woman is now gone, but the family goes to inspect Tabitha's body, and clearly her body has been touched. She's got a straight, cut right from the top of her head, right close to the bridge of her nose.
Her hair's been cut, and then her pants have been pulled down, her outfit has been pulled down. Her shoes that were specially made just for her that were in her casket, they're now gone. Everybody, they're just in shock. You realize that some crazy woman has come in here and desecrated this body.
Here you've got just absolute pandemonium unfolding. It's just, you can't put into words how devastating that was for this victim's family to just see.
There is one thing that we always hold sacred in this country, and that is how you treat a person who's passed away. And this just violated every tenet of that for sure.
Tabitha's family place a call to the police.
This is never a call you ever get, ever. And it just gets crazier from there.
And so the officers at that time, when they got there, they see Tabitha, they see a disheveled body lying in a casket. They see that the makeup is messed up. They see that the incision on her face. And those are all really unusual things. Those are things that should not have happened and that the officers were shocked to see. It feels like the crime was a personal attack on this person. They start taking photographs. They start collecting evidence, looking around, looking at the body, making observations.
And down next to the casket, there's hair. Tabitha's hair has been cut, and there's some of the hair laying on the ground.
While police are processing the crime scene at the funeral home, another call is placed to dispatch from Tabitha's family, who are now at her apartment.
They learned that the suspect may possibly be at the apartment.
They're reporting, we think this person who was just down at the funeral home is over at our house, and we need to get somebody over here right now.
Hours earlier, Monty Smith receives a disturbing message from Shayna.
I opened it up and looked at it, and It was a picture of Tabitha in her casket. I was very shocked to see her with this picture. I didn't understand why. Why do you have this picture? You know, where did you get this from? And then she also said, that bitch looks ugly in her casket. I can't believe you're messing with her. I was confused. I didn't know what she meant by that.
Once Monty finds out what Shayna has done, his life will never be the same.
It's beyond me, you know, why she would do what she did.
I've seen a lot of strange cases in my 31 years, and this one takes the cake. So many twists and turns along the way, and then it became frightening and more bizarre. It just became crazy.
After receiving the pictures from Shayna, Monty Smith returns home to find her in a frenzied state.
Shayna says, take your daughter out of the car and grab her car seat too. After I took my daughter out, she drove off. That left me and my daughter sitting there. This was probably about 5:30 in the evening. Had no clue where she was going.
It's 7:30 p.m. when police arrive at Tabitha's apartment.
They meet a bunch of Tabitha's family outside in the parking lot. And at that point, Tabitha's family tells them, there's someone inside our apartment and we didn't invite her in.
It's a heightened level of tension for the family members. It's like she's inside.
They learned that this woman had showed up at the door of Tabitha Lynch's apartment. She says, my name's Stephanie, and I'm here because something happened to your mother's makeup at the funeral home.
The woman claims she wanted a photo of Tabitha in order to fix her makeup.
And so she makes up this ruse to get inside the apartment, and at some point, the family kind of gets suspicious. So the police go inside the apartment, and what they find is this disheveled, jittery-looking woman who appears out of place. She doesn't seem like she belongs there.
Police search the suspect and discover incriminating evidence.
They find a knife and a box cutter in her pockets. They find some hair in her pocket. And so it was apparent to them at that point that this person was related to what had happened at the funeral home. A few of the family members recognized this girl who identified herself as Stephanie as actually Shayna Sims. And when they start talking to police officers, they tell them that Shayna is actually the wife of Monty Smith, and Monty is a longtime friend of Tabitha Lynch.
Monty is putting his daughter to bed when his phone rings.
It was Shayna. Her voice was shaky. She's telling me, come save her. Then the next thing, I heard voices in the background, and she was telling them to stop and let her go. And they said, no, you're not going anywhere. And I was like, who's that in the background? What are you talking about? And she said, I'm at your dead bitch's house. You can't be. What do you mean? So I got my daughter up and I drove to Tabitha's home. As I'm driving over there, I'm still trying to wrap my head around what all just happened. And then once I arrived there, it was already chaos at that point. They have Shayna in the police car. As soon as they open the car door, she's trying to tell me that she's being accused of messing with Tabitha's body and that they're saying that she's, stole some stuff from them. She did not. That's why I told them to close the door. I didn't want to hear anymore.
Police believe Shayna wanted to break into Tabitha's apartment to steal a personal item she could keep as a trophy. The next day, the Tulsa media seizes on the story.
We immediately went to the scene to try to figure out what on earth was happening. And just what we learned that day, nobody in their right mind would go into a funeral home and do these terrible things to someone who's already passed away. Because what threat are they at that point?
Shayna's act of desecration is so unusual that police are hard-pressed to find the correct laws with which to charge her.
They initially charged her with burglary because she had entered the apartment under false pretenses. They charged her with illegal dissection because that was essentially the closest thing they could find to coming up with that cut on Tabitha's face.
They told me what she was being charged with, and I'm blown away. 100% total shock.
That is a whole new level of crazy. It's way beyond anything that I could ever imagine someone doing.
It seems impossible, but things actually get crazier.
My sergeant came in and said, "Hey, I got a message from the funeral home that we need to go out and take a look at the body again." I grabbed one of my detective partners and my sergeant, and we went out there. So when we examined the body, we found that Tabitha's breasts had been crudely cut out of her body. We also noticed that one of her toes was missing. I had, at that point, worked hundreds of homicides as a crime scene detective, and I had not ever seen anything like this.
The investigators talk with Monty, who shows them the photographs that Shayna had texted him the previous day. They are the equivalent of a smoking gun.
So I see a hand holding a knife next to a toe. I recognize that as probably Tabitha's foot. And I see there's photographs of a hand next to what I assume to be Tabitha's genitalia. And I realize that I'm looking at photographs of Shayna in the act, committing these heinous acts at the funeral home.
I was disturbed, kind of, heartbroken. Couldn't believe that she did this to someone that I knew and that had passed away. A total disrespect.
How are you going to explain those photos? I mean, that just kind of seals her fate. Pictures of what she's actually doing.
When the case goes to trial in April 2016, Shayna is charged with 3 misdemeanors and 2 felonies.
A woman accused of slashing the body of her husband's former girlfriend is expected in court today.
This is a case that is revenge. This is the ex getting involved with her husband, and so she's going to do something about that.
I don't remember any emotion from Shayna. The defense had tried very early on in the process to say she wasn't competent to stand trial because she's got, mental issues, but she was given a thorough exam. That was part of her pre-trial process, and she was found competent to stand trial. The defense were like, look, she's just a woman pushed over the edge like any woman would be. Her husband's having an affair, the victim is texting her and rubbing her face in it. What else would a woman do?
The prosecution call a number of witnesses, including Monty.
Seeing Shayna in the courtroom and being asked questions, and she's staring at me, trying to intimidate me. I answer the questions and try to get through it.
And then the jury goes out. It's right before lunchtime. It's like 11:45 in the morning. And I didn't think it would take too long. So 3 hours later, almost to the minute, they called us back in the courtroom, and that's when the verdict was read.
They found her guilty of all the counts. All those counts were ordered to run consecutive. It all totaled up to 16 total years.
I guess you could say I felt a kind of peace.
Monty divorces Shayna a year later and gets full custody of their daughter.
I can't imagine, what he had to go through, what he had to tell his daughter, all the ramifications of that. That's tough.
Less than 4 years into Shayna's sentence, a new law is struck in Oklahoma that gives her a loophole to appeal.
Shayna Sims has been released from prison after serving 4 years of her sentence.
I was like, she can't be. There's no way. I couldn't believe it. I was in shock.
It was just a gut punch to everybody.
It was devastating to me when I found out. I felt rage at that point. I couldn't believe it.
In November 2021, Monty Smith's ex-wife Shayna Sims is set free, less than 4 years into a 16-year sentence for desecrating Tabitha Lynch's body.
I was like, she can't be. There's no way. But sure enough, I did get confirmation message later that day that she was released. I actually saw a video of her being released.
She just gets to walk. She spends a few years in prison for all the damage she's caused, and she gets to walk.
You couldn't ask for a more devastating blow to the victim's family.
It was a shock. It was really a kick in the gut that we learned that she was going to be walking free after we put this case together. To have someone walking free was tough to swallow.
Shayna has been released on appeal as a result of a Supreme Court ruling known as the McGirt decision.
The McGirt decision, in essence, basically told Oklahoma if somebody was a Native American, either as a defendant or as a victim, that the state of Oklahoma had no jurisdiction to handle those prosecutions.
The United States Supreme Court said that the state of Oklahoma can't arrest Native Americans, our prosecutors can't prosecute crimes involving Native Americans, and so that brought into question thousands and thousands of cases over the years where a Native American was either a victim or a suspect.
This new law is supposed to protect Native Americans.
But what did Shayna Sims do? She figured out that Tabitha had Native American blood in her. You can't prosecute me for this crime. And literally, she got her case dismissed because of that McGirt decision. Shayna Sims, somebody has zero Native American blood in her, gets the benefit of victimizing somebody who was a Native American and walks around as though she's got no consequences. It's just so upsetting.
Once Shayna is out of jail, she can't seem to stay out of trouble.
Monty was worried about what she might do. Of course, the victim's family, Tabitha's family, was really worried and stressed about what she might do or who she might target. She gets arrested for stealing a car, then gets in trouble for assaulting her mother. It's just one thing after another. Monty's big concern was protecting his daughter, because now that she's free, what would stop her from trying to get custody?
I got a phone call from Shayna wanting to speak with her daughter. I did not know, I couldn't believe it. I was in shock. I ignored it for the first few days. She kept calling.
He didn't know what her plans were or what she was capable of doing now that she's out of jail.
Monty talks with their daughter, who tells him she wants to meet her mother. He drops her off for a weekend at her grandmother's house, where Shayna is staying.
Thought to myself, give it a try just one time and see how it goes. Shayna and her mom, they were yelling at each other and having confrontation in front of my daughter when she's not used to seeing that. And she told me herself that she didn't want to be around that, and she didn't want to see them. So I did not force her at that point to go back anymore. And that's where we are to this current day.
Monty still has full custody of his daughter. So yes, he, was doing his best to keep his daughter safe, to keep Shayna away.
Despite being warned about not going anywhere near Tabitha's relatives, Shayna defies the order.
And then, sure enough, Shayna then goes to the victim's family's apartment, and she's like, oh, I wasn't there to see them, which is a lie. You're only there to harass that poor family who's already been through so much. All you have to do to stay out of jail is stay over in your county. But she can't help herself again. She comes over here, and of course, that puts the family in terror. They are afraid of why she keeps showing up there and what she might do. And so, of course, yes, she's arrested and put back in.
Recognizing that Shayna is still a threat, Oklahoma state prosecutors file an appeal.
We had another case. It was called Castro Huerta, which was somebody who was clearly not a Native American, who'd victimized children who were Native American. And we took that fact pattern back up to the United States Supreme Court and asked them to revisit, in essence, the McGirt decision. So then we immediately took that decision, petitioned the court, got her dismissal set aside, and remanded Shayna Sims back to prison, which is where she's at today.
In February 2023, Shayna's sentence and conviction are reinstated, and she is sent back to prison to serve the remaining 12 years.
So it's definitely a relief, for all of us that she's back in jail. Me personally, I don't think 16 years is long enough.
I'm at peace in my life. My daughter's at peace. She's happy. I've never let this be a problem for her.
Monty has this smile that whenever he's in good spirits, and it shows. He just glows. And I love to see my brother when he's happy and when everything is going good.
I feel like after all this is said and done, it's like looking at the damage after a tornado or after a disaster, and how are you gonna put your life back together after this?
I don't know of any person that could have withstanded what he had to go through, especially these past 6 or 7 years. But he did it. I always love him for that.
I'm still in the stages of putting my life back together and moving forward. But it's built me to be a stronger person.
The knock came at a time when doors are not meant to open. A hollow thud against wood that split the dark like a gunshot. And for a split second in a quiet Ohio neighborhood in 1994, the night itself seemed to hold its breath, because nothing good ever arrives after midnight. Not in a town where people still sleep with windows cracked in summer and trust the sound of cicadas more than sirens. Not in a place that would soon learn how quickly ordinary hours can turn radioactive. How a single, unanswered question can poison decades. How a life can vanish so completely that even memory begins to feel unreliable. Because this is where it begins, with a house that looks like every other house, a porch light flickering, a street empty enough to hear your own pulse, and a truth that would refuse to surface for years while everyone kept asking the same question in different voices, in different rooms, in different decades. How does someone disappear without a sound? Ohio, early autumn 1994, a year when payphones still rang, when cassette tapes rattled in car decks, when the evening news came on at 6 sharp and people believed that if something terrible happened nearby, they would hear about it right away. But the first reports didn't come from a newsroom, they came from neighbors, from a mother who didn't come home, from a car still parked where it shouldn't be, from a routine that broke so subtly at first that no one realized it was breaking at all. Because the victim, young, dependable, painfully ordinary in the way that makes you invisible to headlines, had patterns, and when patterns shatter, someone notices eventually. Her name moved through the community like a whisper at first, spoken softly in grocery aisles and church parking lots. Because this wasn't Cleveland or Columbus, this was a place where faces repeat themselves, where strangers are rare and violence is something that happens elsewhere, on television, far away, and when she didn't answer her phone, when she didn't show up where she was supposed to be, people told themselves stories to stay calm. Maybe she stayed over with a friend, maybe she needed space, maybe she just forgot to call. But then the hours stretched, and the hours became a night, and the night became a morning that felt wrong in the way only bad mornings do, heavy, quiet, stripped of excuses. Police arrived to a scene that looked insultingly normal. No shattered glass. No blood on the floor. No overturned furniture screaming for attention. Just absence. Just the echo of someone who should have been there and wasn't. And that absence was everywhere. In the coffee cup left unwashed. In the shoes by the door. In the half-written note on the counter that ended mid-sentence like a thought interrupted by something sudden and irreversible. Because disappearances don't announce themselves. They seep. They spread. They make investigators question whether they're chasing a crime or a coincidence, whether they're standing at the edge of something violent or simply staring into the void of adult choice. The first days were frantic, phone calls logged, addresses checked, friends interviewed with the careful tone of people who don't yet understand that their words will be replayed for years, that every shrug and hesitation will someday be dissected under fluorescent lights, because at the beginning, everyone is just trying to help, everyone remembers something small, something useless, something that feels important only in hindsight, a strange car seen once, a look that lingered too long, conversation that didn't feel right, but none of it lines up, none of it locks into place, and investigators are left holding fragments that refuse to become a picture. Search teams moved through fields and along tree lines, boots sinking into damp earth, radios crackling with the sound of controlled urgency, while the community watched from the edges, offering coffee, offering prayers, offering hope that still felt reasonable in those early hours, because hope is loud at the beginning. It shouts over fear. It insists that missing doesn't mean gone. Not yet, not here, not to someone we know. But hope begins to thin when days pass without answers, when dogs lose the scent, when the map fills with red circles that lead nowhere, when every promising lead collapses into nothing. By the end of the first week, the word everyone was avoiding slipped into conversations like a blade, Cold case, spoken quietly, as if saying it too loudly might make it real, because cold case doesn't mean finished, it means frozen. It means suspended in a state where time keeps moving but truth does not, where evidence degrades and memories rot and witnesses change their stories not because they're lying but because the human brain is not designed to preserve clarity under pressure. And Ohio, in 1994, was not ready to understand what it means to live with an open wound like that. Investigators circled back to the last known hours, the final confirmed sighting, the timeline that would become gospel and curse, because everything depends on when she was last seen alive, who saw her, what she said, what she wore, where she was going, and here the story begins to fracture because people remembered different versions. One said she looked distracted, another said she was in a hurry, someone else insisted she seemed perfectly normal, and normal is the most dangerous word in any investigation because normal explains nothing and hides everything. They examined her car, still parked, still locked, no sign of struggle, no fingerprints that didn't belong, nothing dramatic enough to satisfy the part of the human mind that wants crimes to look like crimes, because real violence often disguises itself as nothing at all, and the absence of evidence became evidence of something darker, something calculated, something that didn't rely on chaos or rage but on familiarity, on trust, on the kind of access that doesn't leave scratches. Names surfaced quietly at first, then with more confidence, co-workers, neighbors, acquaintances who suddenly found themselves at the center of whispered speculation. Because in small communities, everyone becomes a suspect eventually, and the pressure is suffocating, marriages strain, friendships crack, people stop making eye contact at the gas station, because you don't know who is being watched, who has been interviewed, who might have said something that sounded wrong to a detective with too little to go on and too much time to think. The family waited in a state of suspended panic, phones always within reach, nights spent half awake, listening for sounds that never came, replaying memories until they felt worn smooth, trying to reconcile the person they knew with the absence that had replaced her, because grief without a body is a special kind of torture. A limbo where you are not allowed closure but cannot move forward, and every time the phone rang, the heart leapt and sank at the same time. As weeks turned into months, the investigation slowed, not because it mattered less, but because momentum is fragile, because tips dried up, because resources shifted to louder cases with blood and headlines and urgency that could be measured, and this one slipped quietly into the background, labeled, filed, categorized, waiting, and that's how cold cases are born, not in a single moment of failure, but in a gradual fading of attention, a slow cooling of outrage, a normalization of the unanswered. But something else was happening beneath the surface, something no one could see in 1994, because science was not ready yet, because the technology that would one day crack this case was still in its infancy, confined to labs and academic papers and cautious predictions, and while detectives chased interviews and alibis, time was quietly preserving something far more powerful than memory, something microscopic, something patient, something that would not forget, even as the town tried to. Years would pass, seasons would repeat, children would grow up hearing the story like a local legend, told with lowered voices and shaking heads. A warning and a mystery rolled into one, and the case would resurface occasionally. Anniversaries marked by short newspaper articles, faded photos printed again like ghosts, reminders that somewhere in the past, something went terribly wrong and was never put right, and every time it resurfaced, it reopened wounds that never truly healed. By the late 90s, the phrase Ohio 1994 cold case carried weight, a shorthand for frustration, for unanswered questions, for the fear that justice can simply run out of time, and investigators who inherited the file felt the pressure immediately, the thickness of the folders, the scribbled notes, the dead ends highlighted in red, because reopening a cold case is like stepping into someone else's nightmare. You are responsible not only for solving the crime, but for understanding every failure that came before you. Still, the case refused to die completely, because someone always remembered something new, because rumors never fully settled, because the absence at the center of it all remained too loud to ignore, and somewhere, locked away in evidence storage, preserved without anyone realizing its future value, was a trace, a silent witness waiting for the right moment, waiting for science to catch up, waiting for a knock in the middle of the night that would finally make sense of everything that came before. And in 1994, standing at the beginning of it all, no one could have imagined how long the shadow would stretch, how deeply it would embed itself into the identity of the community, how many lives it would brush against without ever fully revealing itself, because at that moment, it was just a missing person, just a quiet street, just a town telling itself that things like this don't happen here, unaware that the story had already begun writing itself in a language no one yet knew how to read. By the time the flyers started to yellow at the edges, curling against telephone poles and grocery store bulletin boards like leaves clinging past their season, the town had already entered a new phase of fear, the kind that doesn't scream anymore but hums constantly in the background. A low electrical buzz that changes how people lock their doors, how they watch unfamiliar cars slow down, how they measure silence, because silence had become suspicious. And in Ohio, 1994, silence was everywhere, spreading through kitchens and classrooms and factory floors where people whispered instead of spoke, afraid that saying her name too loudly might summon the truth they weren't ready to face. Investigators kept working, even as the spotlight dimmed, returning again and again to the same narrow window of time, those last confirmed hours that now felt mythic in their importance, because everything hinged on what happened in that space between ordinary routine and permanent disappearance, and the more they scrutinized it, the more it seemed to resist explanation, a timeline with gaps just wide enough for something terrible to slip through unnoticed, because the most dangerous moments are often the quiet ones, the moments that don't announce themselves as turning points until it's far too late. Witnesses were re-interviewed, voices recorded on tape that hissed softly in the background, every pause and sigh preserved like evidence itself, and what emerged was not clarity but contradiction. Small inconsistencies that could mean nothing or everything, depending on how you looked at them, because one person's certainty was another's doubt, and memory under pressure bends in subtle ways, reshaping itself around fear and guilt and the simple desire to be helpful, and detectives were left to decide which version of reality deserved their faith. There was the coworker who swore she seemed distracted that afternoon, eyes drifting, answers delayed, as if something heavy was already pressing on her thoughts. And there was another who insisted she laughed, joked, talked about weekend plans, perfectly normal, perfectly alive, and those two images refused to coexist, because you cannot be both carefree and preoccupied at the same time, unless you are carrying something you don't want anyone else to see, unless you are standing on the edge of something that has not yet announced itself as danger. They traced phone records, short lists by modern standards, numbers scribbled onto legal pads, because in 1994, every call mattered, every outgoing ring a potential lifeline, and what they found was unsettling in its simplicity. No frantic last call, no desperate reach for help, just routine conversations, just the steady rhythm of an ordinary life that ended without warning, and the absence of a final cry felt louder than any recorded scream. Attention turned to relationships because violence rarely emerges from nowhere, it grows in familiar soil, watered by proximity and access and trust, and detectives began asking questions that made people uncomfortable about arguments, about secrets, about anyone who might have wanted control, might have feared exposure, might have believed they could act without consequence, and these questions rippled outward, touching marriages, friendships, reputations, because suspicion is contagious, and once introduced, it spreads fast. Some cooperated eagerly, relieved to talk, to unburden themselves of the weight of being adjacent to a mystery, while others bristled, answers clipped, body language closed, the kind of behavior that makes detectives lean forward in their chairs, because defensiveness doesn't prove guilt, but it feeds doubt, and doubt is fuel in an investigation running low on certainties. Rumors began to circulate, half-formed stories that grew sharper with each retelling. A strange car seen idling too long, a heated argument overheard through a thin apartment wall, a relationship that wasn't as stable as it appeared from the outside, and while investigators officially dismissed most of it as noise, they still listened, because sometimes the truth hides inside exaggeration, distorted but persistent, and the challenge is knowing which whispers deserve pursuit and which will only lead you deeper into the fog. The search for physical evidence intensified, not because they expected to find something new, but because they feared losing what little they had to time and neglect, and storage rooms were combed, boxes opened, tags checked and rechecked, because in cold cases, preservation becomes as important as discovery, the quiet act of protecting tomorrow's answers from today's ignorance, and no one could afford to admit how much depended on things they didn't yet understand. Meanwhile, the family learned to live inside uncertainty, a daily routine built around absence, meals cooked for one less person, holidays marked by an empty chair that no one acknowledged directly but everyone saw, and the psychological toll was immense, because hope without information is exhausting, and grief without confirmation is a wound that never closes. And every official update felt like a betrayal of expectation, carefully worded statements that said everything and nothing at the same time. Media attention flared occasionally, sparked by anniversaries or new appeals for information. Cameras returning to the quiet street, reporters asking the same questions with different phrasing, because repetition creates the illusion of progress, and viewers at home nodded along, sympathetic but detached, unaware that for the people living it, each broadcast reopened the case like a scar torn fresh, dragging the past into the present without offering relief. As months bled into years, investigators faced an unspoken reality, the kind that creeps into conversations late at night when the office is empty and the coffee has gone cold. The reality that without new evidence, the case was drifting, not solved, not closed, just suspended, and suspension is the cruelest state of all, because it suggests that answers exist but are just out of reach, dangling somewhere beyond the grasp of current tools and methods. Still, they refused to let it go completely, revisiting old notes, cross-referencing names, rerunning checks that had already failed once, because persistence is the only weapon left when momentum is gone, and occasionally, something small would catch their attention. A detail that hadn't mattered before, a timeline discrepancy, a remark buried deep in an interview transcript, and for a moment the case would feel warm again, alive with possibility before cooling once more. Technology crept forward in the background, unnoticed by most, advances discussed in conferences and journals. The early promise of DNA analysis whispered like a rumor among forensic specialists, still expensive, still limited, still unreliable in the eyes of many departments, but growing steadily, refining itself, waiting for the right convergence of evidence and opportunity, because revolutions rarely announce themselves loudly at first. They begin quietly, in labs far removed from the streets where their impact will eventually be felt. In Ohio, 1994, no one could yet imagine how decisive that science would become, how it would transform forgotten samples into voices, but somewhere in evidence storage, sealed and labeled, was a piece of the past that had not lost its power, a fragment of truth that did not age the way memories do. And while the town learned to live with its unanswered question, while detectives filed reports and families clung to fragile hope, that fragment waited, patient, immutable, ready to speak when the world was finally prepared to listen. And so the case continued, not forward, not backward, but inward, curling into itself, embedding deeper into the identity of everyone it touched. A quiet reminder that time does not heal all wounds, that some mysteries simply learn how to hide better, and that beneath the calm surface of a community convinced it knows itself, there can exist a darkness that refuses to be named, only endured. By the turn of the millennium, the case no longer lived on the front pages. It lived in filing cabinets and late-night thoughts, in the quiet rituals of detectives who still pulled the folder once in a while just to remind themselves it existed, just to reassure their conscience that forgetting was not the same as abandoning. Because in law enforcement, unresolved cases don't disappear, they sink, settling into layers of bureaucracy and time where they wait for something to disturb the sediment. And in Ohio, the 1994 disappearance had become exactly that, a weight resting at the bottom of institutional memory. The neighborhood changed the way all neighborhoods change. Families moved, children grew up, houses were repainted, but the geography of the case remained frozen, mapped and remapped in diagrams that still pointed to the same corners, the same intersections, the same quiet stretches of road where something might have happened or might not have happened at all, because absence leaves no footprints, and detectives were forced to imagine scenarios without the comfort of confirmation. A dangerous exercise that requires discipline to keep fantasy from masquerading as theory. New investigators inherited the case, younger, trained with slightly better tools, slightly more skepticism, but burdened by the same gaps, the same missing pieces that had frustrated their predecessors, and they approached it cautiously, knowing that cold cases are fragile, that one careless assumption can warp an entire line of inquiry, and that reopening wounds without delivering answers can be worse than leaving them alone. Yet something about this file refused to let go, a sense that the truth was not gone, only misfiled by time. They started by reevaluating what had been dismissed as mundane, because in hindsight, mundanity often conceals the most significant clues, and they questioned why the scene had been so clean, why there were no signs of forced entry, no chaos, no struggle, because those absences suggested familiarity, a voluntary interaction that turned involuntary only after it was too late. And that implication narrowed the field in ways that made people uncomfortable, because it pointed inward, not outward. Attention returned to people who had once been cleared, not because new evidence had emerged against them, but because clearance in the early 90s did not mean what it means now. Methods were cruder, databases smaller, biases unexamined, and the assumption that truth reveals itself quickly had led to premature conclusions, and reopening those assumptions felt like an accusation, even when it wasn't meant to be, because time changes the stakes, and what once seemed implausible can become probable under a different light. Interviews were revisited, not repeated verbatim, but reframed, questions asked differently, pauses allowed to stretch longer, because people tell different truths depending on how they're asked, and what emerged was subtle but unsettling, tiny shifts in emphasis, details that had grown sharper or fuzzier over time, contradictions that might have been honest memory decay or something more deliberate, and detectives learned to read between the lines, listening not just to what was said, but to what was avoided. Some witnesses had moved on, relocated, built new lives, and being dragged back into a decades-old mystery felt intrusive, even cruel, and resentment sometimes colored their responses, because reopening a cold case means reopening old fears, old suspicions, and not everyone wants to remember who they were when the town was watching them, when their words were measured and their movements quietly tracked. But reluctance itself became data, another variable to be weighed, not judged, but never ignored. The family remained constant, a fixed point in a shifting landscape, aging in real time, carrying the case forward through sheer endurance, marking anniversaries with quiet determination, pushing for answers even when the system seemed content to let time erode urgency, because for them, the past was not past, it was present, pressing, unrelenting, and their persistence kept the file from being fully buried, kept it alive enough to be noticed when opportunity finally arrived. That opportunity began to take shape in the early 2000s, not as a dramatic breakthrough, but as a bureaucratic conversation, a discussion about evidence retention, about whether old samples could be tested using newer techniques, about budgets and priorities, and the uncomfortable question of how much effort should be invested in cases without guarantees. And these conversations rarely make headlines, but they decide the fate of investigations more often than confessions do. Somewhere along the way, a decision was made, tentative at first, to inventory the physical evidence again, to see what still existed, what condition it was in, what might be worth re-examining. And that process was painstaking, methodical, almost boring, boxes opened under sterile lights, items cataloged and photographed, because hope in cold cases does not arrive as a rush. It arrives as paperwork, as patience, as the willingness to believe that the past has not exhausted its ability to speak. When they found it, it didn't look like much. It never does. A small, unremarkable piece of evidence that had been collected almost as an afterthought, stored correctly but without expectation. Because in 1994, its potential had been theoretical at best, and now, years later, it sat quietly in gloved hands, waiting to be reinterpreted, and the room felt heavier in that moment, charged with the possibility that something long silent was about to find its voice. Testing was not immediate, it never is. Approvals had to be secured, protocols followed, chain of custody documented meticulously, because any result, no matter how promising, would be useless if its integrity could be questioned. And so the waiting continued, layered now with a new kind of tension, not the frantic urgency of the early days, but a controlled anticipation that made every update feel amplified. While the evidence waited for its turn in the lab, investigators revisited the broader context, asking themselves again what kind of person could have committed a crime so clean, so quiet, and lived with it for years without exposure, because longevity suggests confidence, perhaps arrogance, the belief that time itself is an ally, that memories fade and systems move on, and that belief had been correct up until now. As the millennium settled in, the case stood on the brink of transformation, though no one involved would have dared say it out loud, because cold cases punish optimism, they have a way of raising expectations only to crush them, and experience had taught everyone to temper hope with caution, to prepare for disappointment even while chasing possibility. Yet beneath the layers of skepticism and restraint, something undeniable stirred, a sense that the story was not finished, that the unanswered question that had haunted Ohio since 1994 was inching closer to articulation, and that whatever truth emerged would not arrive gently. It would arrive like a shockwave, reverberating through a community that had grown accustomed to living with silence, unaware that the silence was about to be broken. The call from the lab did not come with fireworks or drama. It came quietly, folded into an ordinary workday, because breakthroughs rarely announce themselves with urgency at first. They slip in sideways, understated, almost apologetic, and when the technician's voice confirmed that there was something there, something usable, something that hadn't degraded into irrelevance after all those years, the room seemed to contract, the air tightening around the people who understood exactly what that meant, because something in a cold case is never just something. It is a door cracking open after years of being welded shut. The evidence had survived time better than memory ever could, preserved in conditions that had seemed excessive back in 1994, tagged and sealed with a kind of bureaucratic care that now felt almost prophetic, because every signature on that chain of custody form represented a small act of faith in a future that hadn't yet arrived, and now that future was standing in the doorway, asking to be let in, asking if the past was finally ready to speak. Testing took time, more time than anyone wanted, because precision matters more than speed when the stakes are this high, and every step was documented, cross-checked, repeated, because one mistake could invalidate everything, could send the case back into hibernation for another decade, and no one involved wanted to be responsible for that kind of delay, not when the weight of years pressed so heavily on their shoulders. As the process unfolded, investigators found themselves revisiting old theories with fresh eyes, not to rewrite history, but to prepare for its possible correction, because DNA does not tell stories on its own. It offers answers only when paired with the right questions, and the challenge was anticipating what those answers might demand, which assumptions they might shatter, which names they might force back into the light after years of comfortable anonymity. The waiting changed the rhythm of the office, conversations quieter, movements more deliberate, because everyone sensed that they were approaching a point of no return, a moment after which the case would no longer belong to the past alone. And that sense of anticipation carried with it a new kind of fear, not fear of failure, but fear of success, because solving a cold case does not simply close a file. It detonates lives, it reassigns guilt, it rewrites community narratives that have hardened over decades. When the results finally arrived, they did not come as a full revelation, not yet, but as a partial illumination, enough to confirm that the sample belonged to someone outside the victim's immediate circle, someone whose presence had never been explained, and that alone was seismic because it validated long-held suspicions that something had been missed, that the clean scene had been misleading, that the absence of chaos had concealed intrusion rather than disproved it. The profile was entered into databases that did not exist in 1994, digital systems capable of searching millions of records in seconds, and as the algorithms did their silent work, investigators felt the strange sensation of surrendering control, of handing the case over to a machine that did not care about local politics or personal reputations, that would simply compare patterns until it found a match or admitted defeat, and that neutrality was both comforting and terrifying. Days passed without a hit, and optimism began to thin again, old habits reasserting themselves, the instinct to brace for disappointment, because cold cases train you to expect silence, and silence is familiar, manageable. But then the alert came through, understated, technical, a notification that would have been meaningless to anyone outside the room. But to those watching the screen, it was an earthquake, a partial match, a thread leading somewhere unexpected. It wasn't a name yet, not directly, but it was enough to open a new avenue, familial searching, a technique that had once been considered controversial, invasive, legally uncertain, now emerging as a powerful tool capable of reaching across generations. Because DNA does not belong to individuals alone, it echoes through families, linking the present to the past in ways that consent forms never fully anticipated. The implications were enormous, and discussions stretched late into the night. Ethical considerations weighed against the obligation to pursue justice, because every step forward now carried the potential to implicate people who had never been suspects, people who had lived ordinary lives unaware that their genetic code might one day pull a buried crime back into the light, and that responsibility sat heavily with the investigators tasked with deciding how far to go. Approval came slowly, layered with conditions and oversight, but it came, and with it, a renewed sense of momentum that had been absent for years, because for the first time since 1994, the case was not just alive, it was moving, progressing towards something tangible, something that could no longer be dismissed as theoretical or wishful thinking. As genealogical trees were constructed, painstakingly mapped through public records and archived data, patterns began to emerge, connections forming like constellations against a dark sky, and while none of it constituted proof on its own, it narrowed the field in a way that felt almost intrusive, because suddenly the circle of possibility was shrinking, and the idea that the perpetrator might still be alive, might still be walking free, became less abstract and more immediate. Investigators returned to the town with new purpose, not to announce progress, but to observe, to quietly reassess familiar faces in light of unfamiliar information, because knowledge changes perception, and what once seemed benign now carried a different weight, and the realization that someone among them might have lived for years under the protection of uncertainty sent a ripple of unease through the community, even though no one yet knew why. The family was informed cautiously, details shared sparingly, because hope is a volatile substance, and after years of disappointment, even good news must be handled carefully. But the shift was unmistakable. A subtle change in tone, in posture, in the way officials spoke about the case, and for the first time in decades, the future did not feel like an endless extension of the past. Somewhere, perhaps unaware, a person connected to that genetic thread was living their life, going to work, returning home, believing the story had ended years ago, believing time had done its erasing work, and that belief, once reasonable, was now dangerously outdated, because the past was no longer content to remain buried, and the quiet patience of science had finally reached the point where waiting was over. The closer the investigation moved toward the present, the more carefully it had to tread, because progress now came with consequences, and every consequence had a human face attached to it, lives that had unfolded in ignorance of the shadow trailing behind them, and detectives understood that the moment a name emerged, the case would stop being an abstract puzzle and start becoming a reckoning, one that would not limit itself to the guilty alone. Genealogical charts grew denser, branches thickening as records were cross-referenced, birth certificates pulled, marriage licenses examined, obituaries scanned for patterns that might explain absence or silence, and with each connection made, the map narrowed, not toward certainty yet, but toward plausibility, because cold cases are not solved in leaps, they are cornered, slowly, methodically, until there is nowhere left to run but forward. One branch kept resurfacing, stubborn, persistent, its proximity to the genetic profile too consistent to ignore, and at the center of it was a family whose history intersected with Ohio in the early 90s, not dramatically, not in a way that would have raised alarms back then, but enough to place them within the orbit of the victim's final days, and that orbit tightened with every record examined, every timeline aligned. Investigators began reconstructing movements from decades earlier, piecing together addresses, employment records, old utility bills, because paper trails, unlike memories, do not soften with time, and what emerged was a portrait of opportunity. Not motive yet, not guilt, but access, proximity, the quiet kind that does not require force or spectacle, the kind that thrives on familiarity and routine. They approached the task cautiously, because premature confrontation could collapse the entire case, and so surveillance was subtle, background checks conducted quietly, conversations held behind closed doors, because when the truth finally surfaced, it needed to stand on evidence strong enough to withstand scrutiny, not just in court, but in the court of public memory, where cold cases are judged harshly and forgiven rarely. The suspect, when his name finally surfaced internally, did not resemble the monster people imagine when they think of unsolved crimes. He looked ordinary, unremarkable, someone who had lived quietly, worked steadily, raised a family, the kind of person whose presence does not linger in a room, and that ordinariness was unsettling, because it suggested that the crime had not been an eruption, but a decision, controlled, deliberate, executed without witnesses and then folded seamlessly back into daily life. Background checks revealed no criminal record that would have raised suspicion in 1994. No history of violence, no trail of chaos, just an unassuming pattern of normalcy that had protected him for years, because systems built to catch repeat offenders often fail when confronted with a single act concealed beneath decades of restraint, and that failure echoed loudly now, reframed by what the evidence was beginning to suggest. Investigators revisited old interviews with this new context in mind, listening again to recordings where his name had appeared only in passing, mentioned once, dismissed quickly because at the time, there had been nothing to hold on to, no evidence to justify further attention, and hearing those moments now was like discovering a missed heartbeat in a long medical chart, a sign that had been there all along but lacked meaning until the diagnosis became clear. Every step forward demanded restraint because they needed more than a genetic association, they needed corroboration, a narrative supported by facts that could withstand cross-examination, and so they worked backward, reconstructing his life in 1994, mapping his routines against hers, looking for intersections that could no longer be explained away as coincidence. The more they looked, the more the puzzle pieces aligned. Small details that had once been meaningless began to resonate. A car similar to one described vaguely by a witness. A schedule that placed him free during critical hours. A connection that explained how he could have approached without raising alarm, and each alignment added weight. Not enough to act yet, but enough to shift the balance from possibility to probability. The family was not told everything. Not yet, because hope can collapse under its own weight if mishandled. But they sensed the change, the subtle confidence in investigators' voices, the way questions were now framed around when instead of if, and that shift was both exhilarating and terrifying, because answers promised relief but also finality, a confirmation of loss that could no longer be postponed. As preparations were made for the next phase, the collection of a direct DNA sample, discussions turned logistical, legal, strategic because timing mattered, approach mattered, and the goal was not just to confirm a match, but to do so in a way that left no room for doubt, no procedural misstep that could unravel years of patient work. Meanwhile, the suspect lived unaware, or perhaps quietly aware in a way that cannot be measured, because people who carry secrets for decades often develop a heightened sensitivity to threat, a way of sensing when the ground beneath them begins to shift, and whether he felt it or not, the ground was shifting now, imperceptibly but inexorably, as investigators closed in with the kind of patience that only cold cases teach. The plan solidified around a simple act, a mundane moment that would carry extraordinary weight. A discarded object, a coffee cup, a cigarette, anything that could carry genetic material without alerting its owner. Because science does not require confession, it requires only a trace, and that trace, once obtained, would speak with a clarity no human witness ever could. As the date approached, tension coiled tightly within the team, because this was the point of commitment, the moment when years of waiting condensed into a single action, and success would mean the beginning of the end, while failure could send the case spiraling back into uncertainty, and no one wanted to imagine explaining that to a family that had waited so long. In the quiet before execution, the case felt alive in a new way, humming with potential, poised on the edge of revelation, and somewhere in Ohio, an ordinary life moved through ordinary routines, unaware that time had finally run out, that the past had found a voice, and that a midnight knock, long delayed, was drawing closer with every passing hour. The moment came without ceremony, tucked inside the ordinary flow of a day that looked like every other day he had lived for years, because this phase of justice does not announce itself with sirens or warrants. It waits patiently for carelessness, for habit, for the tiny lapses people never imagined could matter, and when the opportunity presented itself, it was almost insultingly simple, a routine action performed without thought, a discarded object left behind as if the world had no interest in it at all. Investigators moved with practiced restraint, no sudden movements, no visible urgency, because urgency invites suspicion, and suspicion can poison evidence before it ever reaches a lab. And when the item was collected, sealed, logged, and transported, the significance of that act was not spoken aloud, but everyone involved felt it, a tightening in the chest, the quiet understanding that decades of waiting had just condensed into a single envelope. The sample was rushed through protocols designed for moments exactly like this, chain of custody documented down to the minute, signatures stacked like layers of armor around the evidence, because now there would be no excuses, no second chances, no blaming technology or time if this failed, and the lab that received it understood the weight it carried, understood that this was not just a test but a reckoning delayed by history. Waiting returned, but it was different now, sharper, more focused, because anticipation had replaced speculation, and every hour stretched like wire pulled too tight, conversations drifting inevitably back to the same question asked in different ways. What if this is it? What if this finally answers everything? And beneath that hope lurked a quieter fear, the fear that even now, even this close, the truth might slip away again. When the confirmation came, it did not hesitate, it did not hedge, it arrived clean and unequivocal. A direct match, numbers and probabilities aligning so precisely that doubt had nowhere left to stand. And in that moment, the case transformed irrevocably, from a mystery to an accusation, from an absence to a presence, because a name now sat at the center of what had once been an empty space. The room went silent, not out of shock, but out of gravity, because confirmation brings responsibility, and everyone understood that what followed would ripple outward, touching lives that had no idea they were about to be rewritten. and for a brief moment, there was no celebration, no satisfaction, only the heavy acknowledgement that the truth, once uncovered, demands action. Procedures shifted immediately, the tone changing from exploratory to operational, because now there was a suspect in the full legal sense, and every move from this point forward would be scrutinized, dissected, challenged, and used to determine whether justice would finally be served or delayed once more by technical failure, and that awareness sharpened every decision. Background information was reviewed again, now with confirmation anchoring interpretation, details that had once been ambiguous snapped into place with unsettling clarity, and the portrait that emerged was not of a man who had lived recklessly, but of one who had lived carefully, consciously, someone who understood the value of restraint, of blending in, of letting time do the work of erasure, and that restraint had been his greatest protection. Investigators debated timing, weighing the risks of immediate arrest against the strategic value of observation, because a person who believes himself safe behaves differently than one who knows he is exposed, and they wanted to see how he moved, who he contacted, whether the pressure of impending discovery would provoke mistakes, admissions, or attempts to disappear, and so they watched, quietly, patiently, learning the rhythms of his life as he had once learned the rhythms of his victims. The community remained unaware, living inside a calm that now felt fragile, because beneath the surface, the case that had haunted Ohio since 1994 was accelerating toward a climax no one had prepared for, and the idea that the answer had been living among them all this time, shopping in the same stores, attending the same events, sharing the same air, carried a chilling implication about proximity and trust. Plans for arrest were drafted with meticulous care, not for spectacle but for precision, because the goal was not drama, it was certainty, the kind that survives courtrooms and appeals, and timing was chosen not to shock the public, but to minimize risk, to ensure that when the moment came it would be decisive, controlled, and final. The family was brought in under careful conditions, informed with a gentleness that acknowledged both the relief and the devastation such news carries, because confirmation does not undo loss, it reframes it, replacing endless uncertainty with a fixed truth that must now be faced, and their reaction was not explosive, but quiet, heavy, the kind of response that comes from people who have learned not to trust good news too quickly. As the night approached, tension settled into the investigators like a second skin, because arrests in cold cases carry a symbolic weight unlike any other. They represent time collapsing, the past reaching forward to seize the present, and everyone involved understood that this was not just about one crime, but about proving that waiting does not always mean forgetting, that patience, however cruel, can still lead somewhere. Somewhere else in Ohio, the suspect moved through his evening unaware of the precision closing in around him, unaware that science had erased the distance he thought time had created, unaware that a knock was coming, not the frantic kind, not the kind meant to warn, but the deliberate, unmistakable sound that signals the end of ordinary life. And as the clock edged toward midnight, the weight of 30 years pressed down on a single moment, ready to break the silence that had protected him for far too long. The street was so quiet that the approaching vehicles sounded louder than they should have. Tires whispering over asphalt, engines kept deliberately low, lights dimmed until they were almost not there at all, because the goal was not to announce themselves to the neighborhood, not to stir curtains, not to wake dogs, but to arrive like inevitability, and inevitability never needs noise, it only needs timing. Midnight in Ohio is a different world, a world of closed blinds and sleeping televisions, of porch lights that burn for no reason except habit. And on that night the air felt cold in a way that had nothing to do with weather, because everyone in those cars carried the same thought in their chests, the same headline pounding behind their ribs. DNA hit. Cold case. Midnight arrest. After decades of silence, this was the moment the past finally reached out and grabbed the present by the throat. They parked down the block, doors opening softly, radios muted, bodies moving with rehearsed precision, and the suspect's house sat ahead like a normal house, pretending it didn't have a history, pretending it hadn't been standing there through all the seasons when the victim's family aged without answers, pretending it had nothing to do with a file that had once been thin and then grew thick with failure and time. There is something obscene about how ordinary the place looked, how easily you could imagine laughter inside, warm lamps, a sleeping dog, because monsters do not always live in shadows. Sometimes they live in neighborhoods where people wave at each other, and that ordinariness is what makes the moment so vicious. The lead detective stood on the porch for a beat longer than necessary, not out of hesitation, but out of awareness, because that door was more than wood and paint. It was a threshold between two eras, between 1994 and now, between what everyone believed and what evidence had proven. And when the knock came, it was firm and controlled, not aggressive, not frantic, just decisive. The kind of knock that says your choices are done, your time is over. Inside, there was movement, slow at first, then quicker, a light flipping on, footsteps that paused as if the person behind the door was listening for something, trying to diagnose the situation by sound alone. And that pause felt endless, because in that pause lived the last illusion of safety. The door opened a few inches, chain still on, a man's face appearing in the gap, half awake, confused, irritated, and for a split second he looked like every other person woken from sleep by an unexpected visitor. But then he saw the badges, the posture, the number of bodies on his porch, and something changed in his eyes, not necessarily panic, not immediately, but a flicker of calculation, as if his brain was already searching for the script that would save him, because people who have survived decades with a secret have rehearsed this moment in their heads, whether they admit it or not. They spoke his name, they identified themselves, they said the words that turned the entire house into a crime scene of consequence, and when they told him he was under arrest, the chain came off, the door swung wider, and the night widened with it, opening to swallow whatever normal life he thought he still owned. Handcuffs clicked with a sound too small for what it represented, metal on skin, a clean mechanical finality, and the suspect stepped onto the porch in bare feet, blinking under the light, a man in the present suddenly forced to answer for the past. Neighbors did not flood their yards with cameras, not at first, because midnight keeps most people asleep, but a few lights came on, a curtain lifted, a silhouette paused in a window, and those silhouettes would become witnesses later, telling reporters, telling friends, repeating the same line that always follows a shock arrest. He seemed so normal. They guided him to the vehicle, heads turning just enough to catch the movement, and as the car door closed, the quiet returned for a moment, but it was a different quiet now, the kind that feels staged, like the world is pretending nothing just happened. In the station, fluorescent lights made everything look harsher, flatter, stripped of the soft lie that darkness provides, and the suspect sat at a table that had witnessed hundreds of denials, a chair that had held every kind of human behavior except innocence itself, because innocence doesn't usually end up there, and the detectives across from him did not rush, did not raise their voices, did not grandstand, because they didn't need to. They had waited years for this. They understood patience as a weapon. And now they had something he did not, certainty. The first questions were procedural, calm, almost polite, because getting someone talking is like opening a jar. You don't smash it, you twist slowly until the seal breaks, and he answered in measured tones, asking what this was about, feigning confusion, attempting the oldest defense in history, distance, the suggestion that time alone should function as an alibi. He spoke as if 1994 was a separate universe, unreachable, irrelevant, a year lost in the fog of memory. But the detectives did not argue about memory. They argued with biology. They slid a folder across the table, papers inside, lab results, charts, numbers, and the suspect's gaze flicked down, then up, then away, because there is a moment when a person realizes that the story they've been telling themselves is no longer compatible with reality. And that moment is visible if you know how to look. His jaw tightened, a muscle pulsing, his fingers tapping once against the table as if his body was trying to generate a rhythm to cling to. The detective's voice stayed level as he said the phrase that turns denial into desperation. Your DNA is in our evidence. Not might be. Not could be. Is. Silence can be louder than shouting, and his silence was deafening because denial requires air, it requires space, and the DNA took up all the space in the room. He tried, briefly, to reframe, to suggest contamination, coincidence, lab error, the kind of technical smoke that people throw when they feel the walls closing in. But the detectives had prepared for that too, because cold case teams live in the details, and they explained chain of custody like a story that had been written years ago and simply needed reading aloud. Dates, signatures, preservation, retesting, independent confirmation, probability so high it bordered on a verdict. His shoulders sank a fraction, not surrender, not yet, but the first crack in the posture of control. Then came the harder questions, the ones that force a person to step into the past with both feet. Where were you that day? How did you know her? Why were you near her? What happened after she vanished? The suspect's answers were careful, too careful, the kind that feel rehearsed, and he leaned on the same strategy that had protected him for decades. Vagueness. I don't remember. It was a long time ago. I can't say. But vagueness is not a shield when the evidence is specific, and the detectives pressed not with anger but with precision, narrowing the timeline like a noose, pulling him closer to a point he could not wriggle away from. Outside those walls, the town began to wake, and news traveled faster than it had in 1994, because now there were phones in every pocket, notifications that lit up bedrooms, texts sent in disbelief, and by sunrise, the community was already vibrating with the kind of shock that makes people feel physically ill. A single sentence flashed across screens like an alarm. Ohio 1994 cold case solved. DNA hit Sparks' midnight arrest. People read it twice, 3 times, as if repetition could make it less real. Then they looked around their kitchens, their driveways, their quiet streets, and the question rose like a toxic vapor. How close were we to him all this time? Old neighbors called each other, voices shaking, comparing memories, trying to reconcile the man they thought they knew with the headline now attached to his name. Some defended him reflexively, because denial is a community's first defense against shame, while others remembered little moments that had felt wrong but were dismissed because life is full of oddness and most oddness isn't evil. A few people grew suddenly quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you wonder what they've been carrying, because cases like this never exist in isolation. They touch more lives than the public ever sees, and every arrest shakes loose new stories. The victim's family received the news like a blow and a breath at the same time, because after decades of waiting, resolution arrives with a strange cruelty, forcing the heart to process relief and grief in the same moment. They had lived so long with the open question that the idea of an answer felt unreal, almost offensive, and yet there it was, arriving not as a gentle closure, but as a midnight arrest, a pair of cuffs, a lab report. They stared at the headline at the word solved, and for a moment it sounded like a lie, because solved implies completion, and their loss had never felt complete, it had felt ongoing, like a sentence without a period. The press began to gather, microphones ready, cameras angled, eager for footage of a suspect being led into court, eager for sound bites, eager for the community's shock, because cold cases are irresistible narratives. They carry the illusion that time can be conquered, that evil cannot hide forever. Investigators held their statements tight, careful not to reveal what they still didn't know, because DNA can identify a person, but it cannot tell you the full story of what happened in those missing hours, and it cannot, by itself, return what was taken. The question that still haunted the case, the one the family felt like a stone in the throat, remained. Where is she? What exactly happened? How far did it go? Inside the interrogation room, the suspect's composure frayed in small ways, a hand running over his face, eyes lingering on the door as if calculating escape routes that no longer existed, and the detectives continued, shifting between empathy and pressure, offering him a chance to explain, to confess, to control the narrative in some final way. Because confession is not just about truth, it is about power, about who gets to define what happened, and they knew that someone who had kept a secret for decades would be reluctant to surrender that power. He did not explode into rage, he did not weep dramatically, he did not deliver a cinematic confession, because real life rarely gives you the satisfaction of a perfect ending. Instead, he hovered in the gray zone that so many suspects choose when cornered by science. Partial admissions, evasive statements, a refusal to fill in the details that would transform suspicion into a complete story. And that refusal, that stubborn withholding, cast a shadow even over the triumph of the arrest, because it reminded everyone of a brutal truth. A case can be solved on paper while still leaving a family starving for the final pieces. Yet the arrest changed everything. It changed the way detectives looked at their own history, forcing them to confront the missed opportunities of 1994, the assumptions that had steered them away, the lack of tools that had left them blind, and it changed the way the community looked at itself, because the enemy had not been an outsider, not a faceless drifter passing through, but a person embedded in ordinary life, proof that danger can wear the mask of routine for decades. As the suspect was moved toward arraignment, the courthouse became a magnet, reporters circling like birds, residents gathering in stunned clusters, and through it all, the victim's name returned to mouths with new urgency, not whispered now, but spoken aloud, anchored at last to action, to a tangible moment in the present. Still, beneath the noise, beneath the flashes of cameras and the official language of justice, the haunting undercurrent remained, the part no headline could satisfy. The missing years, the missing truth, the missing person whose absence had shaped an entire town. And in the quiet spaces between updates, when the adrenaline began to drain and reality settled in, Ohio felt the weight of what had just happened. Because a midnight arrest does not end a story. It ignites a new chapter. One where answers come with consequences, where the past insists on being fully revealed, and where the community must face the unsettling possibility that even now, after DNA, after handcuffs, after the headline, some of the most terrifying questions may still be waiting in the dark. The courthouse smelled like old stone and fresh coffee, a mix of history and exhaustion, and outside, the morning air was crowded with the sound of cameras clicking, reporters rehearsing their lines under their breath, and neighbors speaking in fragments as if full sentences might make the situation too real. Because once a cold case bursts back into the present, it doesn't arrive politely, it crashes, it forces everyone to choose a side of the shock. Either you believe the system has finally won, or you begin to wonder what else has been hidden in plain sight all along. The suspect was brought in through a side entrance, away from the densest cluster of microphones, but it didn't matter, because the story was already out there, floating through the town like smoke, and every person watching had the same sensation. The skin-crawling recognition that this was not just news, it was a collision between decades, a merging of a ghost year and a living one. Inside, legal language wrapped the room in a cold, procedural calm, the kind of calm that can feel insulting when you've waited 30 years for a single name, because justice has a vocabulary that avoids emotion, that strips pain down to docket numbers and charges, and as the suspect stood before the judge, his posture was practiced, shoulders squared, face expressionless, the look of a man trying to remain ordinary even as his life detonated. When the charges were read, the words landed with the precision of a blade, and the community's reaction outside was immediate, raw, a mix of disbelief and a savage, almost hungry need for details, because the arrest had answered one question and inflamed 10 more, and the loudest one, sharp enough to cut through everything, was the one no one had been able to answer since 1994. Where is she? Investigators knew that question was now a ticking device, because the case, despite the DNA, was still partially in the dark, and the dark is where defense attorneys thrive. They had the match. They had the probability. They had the kind of scientific certainty that turns skeptics into believers. But science is not the whole story, not in court, not in the public imagination, and not for a family that had learned the hard way that a solved case can still feel unsolved when the most crucial truth remains missing. DNA can place someone in contact. It doesn't always explain what happened after, and the missing years were a cavern the prosecution would have to cross carefully, one step at a time, because one reckless leap could collapse the entire bridge. Back at the station, the cold case team moved like people carrying something fragile, a careful intensity in every exchange, because now the clock was running in a different way, not toward discovery but toward accountability, and accountability requires structure. They began building a narrative that could withstand scrutiny, pulling every record they could, relining the timeline, making it airtight not because they doubted the truth but because truth without support is vulnerable, and vulnerability is exactly what the defense would attack. Old witness statements were reread, not for comfort but for leverage, because now those small inconsistencies from decades ago could be reframed, elevated, connected to a suspect with a name and a face, and suddenly the things people had shrugged off in 1994 became terrifying, because they were no longer vague, they were now potentially relevant. They found themselves looking at the town differently, too, because once you discover a killer has lived among you, you start reinterpreting everything. Every friendly wave, every neighborhood barbecue, every mundane interaction, through a darker lens, as if the community's entire history had been living under a thin sheet of glass that had just cracked. People began calling in tips again, not because they had new information, but because memory reacts to shock like a chemical. It bubbles, it stirs, it produces unexpected reactions. Someone remembered a car parked oddly in an alley years ago. Someone else recalled a conversation that had felt off. A remark made at a party that now sounded like a confession in disguise. Another person, older now, admitted they had seen something that night but said nothing because fear had been louder than conscience. The phones rang constantly, voices trembling, and investigators listened, knowing most tips would lead nowhere, but also knowing that once a suspect is named, the truth sometimes starts leaking out of places it had been sealed inside for years. They returned to the suspect, not in a single dramatic interrogation, but in a sequence of measured contacts, because pressure works better when it's applied over time, like a slow tightening around the mind. The suspect's attorney did what attorneys are trained to do: limit exposure, reduce risk, block access to the one thing detectives still wanted more than anything: words. Yet even silence becomes part of a case, because silence has a shape, it casts a shadow, it makes juries lean in, it makes communities speculate, and speculation in a small town becomes a second investigation running parallel to the official one. Messy, emotional, often wrong, but impossible to stop. The family stood at the center of it, pulled between relief and rage, because relief feels wrong when you're still missing the most fundamental piece, and rage feels endless when you realize you might never get it. They had dreamed of this moment for decades. Someone held accountable, someone finally named, but dreams don't include the aftermath: the press at your door, the strangers offering condolences that feel like intrusions, the bitter realization that solved is a word the world uses to move on, while you're still stuck in the same place, still asking the same question. They watched the suspect's face on television, saw him stand there with his jaw clenched, his eyes guarded, and they searched his expression for something human, some flicker of remorse, some crack that suggested he might tell them what they needed to know. But remorse is not guaranteed, and truth is not always given freely. Sometimes it has to be extracted, and sometimes, even then, it stays buried. Investigators shifted strategy. If he wouldn't speak, the environment might. They began combing through the suspect's history the way you sift through a burned building after the flames are gone, looking for structural clues, for places where the past might have left residue. They looked at property records. Where had he lived in the mid-90s? What land had he had access to? What jobs had given him mobility, privacy, storage? They examined old vehicles registered in his name, long since sold or scrapped, because metal can hold stories, and though time is cruel, it doesn't always erase everything. They dug into employment histories, into old timesheets and shift records, into any data that could place him within reach of the victim during those missing hours. They pursued acquaintances quietly, not with accusations, but with questions designed to pry open what people might have protected out of loyalty, fear, or denial. Because the suspect had not lived in a vacuum. He had lived among people. And people, even when they don't know everything, often know something. The community's shock matured into something colder: suspicion with direction. It wasn't abstract anymore. Now there was a target, and that target had connections: friends, relatives, co-workers, people who suddenly found themselves under the glare of public curiosity. Some were furious at investigators, accusing them of dredging up pain for attention, but others began to cooperate in ways they never had before, because once the illusion of normal breaks, loyalty changes shape. People who had brushed off odd behavior in the past began describing it in sharper terms: temper, a controlling streak, an obsession with privacy, a pattern of disappearing for hours without explanation. It might have been nothing. It might have been everything. And detectives recorded it all, not because they trusted every story, but because patterns, when repeated across different mouths, can become evidence in the only way cold cases allow: through accumulation. Search warrants followed, not broad and theatrical, but precise, targeted, designed to withstand challenge. Locations connected to the suspect's past were revisited with modern tools: ground-penetrating radar, refined cadaver dogs, forensic mapping techniques that didn't exist when the victim first vanished. Each search site had its own tension, its own cruel hope, because every shovel of dirt carried the possibility of ending decades of limbo, and every shovel that found nothing carried the possibility that the truth had been moved, buried deeper, scattered, or destroyed. The suspect had years to plan, years to adapt, years to relocate evidence the way people relocate furniture, quietly, deliberately, and the longer time passes, the more the landscape itself becomes complicit. Trees grow, soil settles, buildings rise on top of old ground, hiding what might lie beneath like a secret tucked under a new floor. Then came the moments that never make headlines but shatter the people living inside them. A dog alerting briefly and then stopping, uncertain. A radar anomaly that turns out to be nothing but debris. A patch of disturbed earth that raises heart rates before collapsing into disappointment. Investigators learned to control their faces, because families watch faces, and hope can rise or die based on a single expression. They learned to speak carefully, because words can become promises unintentionally, and promises are dangerous in a case that has already broken so many. Behind closed doors, prosecutors began building the case for trial, aware that without a body, without a confession, the defense would try to turn absence into reasonable doubt, arguing that DNA alone cannot prove homicide, that contact does not equal murder, that the victim could have left voluntarily and never returned, and the absurdity of that argument did not matter, because courtrooms are not built for emotion, they are built for proof, and proof must be arranged like architecture. Supported, reinforced, capable of standing even under attack. The prosecution's task was to transform the narrative from "she vanished" into "he did it." Not in the language of grief, but in the language of law. Meanwhile, the suspect's world unraveled in the way it always does when old crimes resurface. People who had once defended him began distancing themselves. Familiar routines evaporated. The simple comfort of anonymity died. And yet, even cornered, even exposed, he still held one thing hostage: the final truth. Where? How? What happened in the hours no one saw? That hostage-taking, silent, stubborn, was its own kind of violence, one that extended the crime into the present, because it forced the family to live through the disappearance again, not as a mystery now, but as a cruelty being actively maintained by a living person who had the power to end it and chose not to. As the investigation stretched into weeks, then months, a new question began to gnaw at the edges of certainty. A question that investigators hated but couldn't ignore. If he had kept this secret for decades, what else had he kept? Cold cases sometimes reveal more than one crime, not because every killer is a serial offender, but because concealment breeds confidence, and confidence can breed repetition. They began cross-checking the suspect's timeline against other unsolved cases, other disappearances, other whispers that had once been filed away as unrelated. They didn't announce it publicly. They didn't want panic. But the possibility hovered in the room like a second shadow. And in the town, the phrase that once felt distant and abstract now felt immediate, tactile, like a bruise you can't stop touching. Cold case. People said it in grocery aisles again. They said it in church, in bars, in text messages sent late at night. They said it with anger, with relief, with fear. The arrest had cracked the story open, but it had not finished it. The heart of it, the missing person, the missing truth, still sat somewhere out there in the dark, and until that heart was found, until the last unanswered question was forced into daylight, the community would remain trapped in a paradox. A case solved on paper and unresolved in the soul. Because the most terrifying thing about a midnight arrest is what it proves. Proves time can be defeated. Proves secrets can be pulled from the past. But it also proves something else, something colder, something that keeps people awake long after the cameras leave. That a person can carry darkness quietly for decades, smiling in daylight, blending into routine, and when that darkness is finally exposed, it doesn't simply disappear. It spills. It stains. It demands more. And the town, braced for closure, began to understand that closure was not a single moment, not a headline, not even handcuffs. Closure was a search still ongoing, a truth still withheld, a story still missing its final, devastating sentence. The town didn't return to normal after the cameras left, because normal had been exposed as a costume, something everyone wore out of habit until a single arrest tore the seams, and now even quiet mornings felt staged, as if the streets were pretending not to remember, as if the houses were pretending they hadn't sheltered decades of assumptions that were suddenly poisonous. People kept checking their phones for updates the way they once checked the weather, expecting the next alert to change the shape of the day, because when a cold case erupts back to life, it doesn't just solve a mystery, it rewires the nervous system of a community. It makes every familiar face feel slightly less familiar, every handshake feel slightly more fragile, and the question that kept returning, relentless, sharp, unsatisfied, was still the same one that had haunted 1994. Where is she? Investigators moved like they were walking on thin ice, careful with every step, because success had made the case more dangerous, not less. Before the arrest, the file was a tragedy. After the arrest, it became a battlefield. Defense teams don't fight facts with facts when the facts are strong. They fight the spaces between them, they pry at timelines, they question methods, they cast shadows where the prosecution wants light. And the biggest shadow in this case was not the DNA match, it was the missing body, the missing last chapter, the missing certainty that a jury could see with their own eyes rather than calculate on a chart. The prosecution understood it in their bones. If they couldn't find her, the defense would try to make her absence their weapon. So the search widened, not wildly, not desperately, but systematically, like a net expanding in slow motion. Old properties tied to the suspect were re-examined with technology that made the past feel vulnerable, ground-penetrating radar scanning Earth that had been undisturbed for decades, cadaver dogs moving with solemn focus, pausing, circling, alerting in ways that made everyone's stomachs turn, because there is no neutral reaction to the possibility of remains. Every site had its own atmosphere, its own cruel rhythm of hope rising and being forced back down. The team learned to breathe shallowly, to speak softly, to avoid the word found, unless it was absolute, because families hear that word like a bell, and a bell cannot be unrung. The suspect watched from behind walls of procedure and counsel, his presence now reduced to paperwork and court appearances, but his silence was not passive. Silence was leverage. Silence was control. Silence was the one remaining form of power he had, and cold cases teach you that power is addictive, that some people will protect it longer than they will protect their own future. Detectives tried pressure. They tried empathy. They tried the slow drip of reality, reminding him of what was coming, of what a jury would see, of how the story would be told with or without his words, because sometimes suspects confess not out of guilt but out of a need to shape the narrative, to edit how history will remember them. But he stayed guarded, answers scarce, expression locked in that flat neutrality that feels almost inhuman under fluorescent light. And yet, small cracks appeared, not dramatic ones, not the kind that make headlines, but the kind that make investigators lean forward. A question he asked that he shouldn't have asked. A detail he denied too quickly. A moment of irritation when a detective used the victim's name instead of saying, "the case." Tiny reactions like telltale ripples on still water. They began to suspect he was not built for confrontation, that he had survived by avoiding direct pressure, by letting time and normal life create a barrier between his actions and accountability. Now that barrier was gone, and his mind had to live in two eras at once, the comfortable present and the radioactive past, and holding both at the same time takes a toll even on the most controlled personality. The community, meanwhile, fractured into factions of grief and disbelief. Some people demanded swift justice, hungry for the satisfaction of punishment after years of uncertainty, while others clung to denial as if it could undo the DNA itself. There has to be an explanation, they said, because believing the alternative meant admitting the unthinkable. That evil had lived close enough to borrow sugar, close enough to wave at your kids, close enough to sit beside you at a school event without triggering any alarm in your instincts. And admitting that creates a kind of existential panic, because it means you cannot trust your own judgment, cannot trust the surface of reality, cannot trust normal. The more the town argued about him, the more they argued about themselves. In private kitchens, people replayed old memories like surveillance footage, looking for moments that now felt like clues. Remember when he got angry over nothing? Remember how he never let anyone into the garage? Remember how he moved suddenly, without explanation? These recollections multiplied, overlapping, contradicting, creating a second narrative that grew in the absence of official answers. Investigators listened carefully because rumor can be garbage, but rumor can also be an early warning system, a chaotic way the public searches for patterns, and sometimes hidden inside the noise there is a name, a place, a habit that points toward something real. The victim's family endured the worst version of this new phase. They had waited decades for movement, and now that movement came like a storm, tearing through their lives again, forcing them into public view, asking them to speak into microphones about pain that never belonged to anyone else. Reporters wanted emotions. Viewers wanted closure. The family wanted one thing, her, or at least the truth of where she was. They tried to be gracious, tried to answer questions with dignity. But the anger was there, hot and constant, because a solved case that still leaves you without a grave is a cruel contradiction, and every headline that used the word closure felt like a slap. Behind the scenes, prosecutors began shaping their argument like a blade, honing it carefully. They focused on what DNA meant in context, not as a standalone miracle, but as a piece of a larger story, supported by opportunity, proximity, and the absence of any innocent explanation. They built the timeline again, not from memory, but from documented anchors, employment records, phone logs, witness statements, patterns of movement. They wanted to show a jury not just that he was connected to the victim, but that his connection existed precisely where it shouldn't, at the precise point where her life vanished. They prepared to explain science in language that could survive fear and skepticism, because DNA is powerful, but in the wrong hands it can be misunderstood, and misunderstanding is a crack a defense can wedge open. The defense, anticipating this, prepared its own story, one that did not need to be true to be effective, only plausible enough to become doubt. They hinted at contamination. They suggested innocent contact. They implied the investigation was being rushed by public pressure, that investigators were eager for a win after decades of failure, and in that implication, they planted a seed. Maybe this arrest is desperation disguised as certainty. Prosecutors heard those whispers and felt the urgency intensify, because nothing is more dangerous than a truth that can't be fully demonstrated, and the missing physical end of the story, the missing remains, the missing final proof, still sat like a stone in the throat of the case. So detectives went back to the geography again, searching for the kinds of places people overlook, not glamorous crime scene locations, but mundane hiding spots. Drainage ditches, abandoned lots, wooded edges behind developments that didn't exist in 1994. They examined maps from that era, aerial photos, property boundaries, construction records. They compared them like puzzle pieces, looking for changes that could have swallowed evidence. New roads laid over old ground, buildings erected on what used to be open fields. They were hunting not just for remains, but for the logic of concealment, trying to think like someone who had needed time to bury a truth and then needed to live with it. And then came a lead that changed the temperature in the room. A tip that arrived not from the public frenzy, but from someone connected to the suspect's old life. Someone older now, voice shaking, offering something they'd held back for years, because fear had been louder than conscience back then. And in the early 90s, fear was a practical force. It shaped decisions. It silenced people. The caller didn't claim to have seen the crime. They claimed something smaller, and smaller is often what breaks cold cases open. A memory of the suspect returning late one night around the time she vanished, dirty in a way that didn't fit his routine, agitated, impatient, talking too fast, and the caller remembered it not because it was obviously criminal, but because it felt wrong, like the atmosphere around him had turned poisonous for a few minutes, and then he had snapped back into normal as if flipping a switch. The caller had dismissed it for years. Now, with the arrest, that memory had transformed into something heavier, something that sounded less like odd behavior and more like a stain. Investigators didn't celebrate. They didn't even exhale. They moved quietly because leads are fragile and truth has a way of dissolving if you handle it too roughly. They verified what they could, checked dates, compared addresses, mapped that old location against places they hadn't searched thoroughly yet. The lead didn't point to a single spot with a red X. It pointed to an area, a zone of possibility which is both promise and torment. But it was enough to adjust the search strategy, enough to justify resources, enough to bring out the equipment again. The next search was conducted under a sky that looked indifferent, because nature doesn't react to human drama. Crews moved in measured lines, grid patterns marked with flags, dogs working the perimeter, investigators watching every movement with held breath, because after all these years, the difference between nothing and something could be a single inch of ground, a single alert, a single anomaly that refused to be explained away. The family was not brought in, not yet. They had been through too many false dawns. The team wanted certainty before they let hope anywhere near them again. Hours passed, then more hours, the kind of hours that make time feel viscous, heavy, and then a dog paused, circled, returned, alerted again with a kind of insistence that made everyone's spine stiffen. The handler's voice was low and controlled. Investigators stepped closer, careful, almost reverent, because whether or not it was her, the possibility of human remains changes the air. Tools came out. Soil was disturbed. Everyone watched the earth like it might suddenly speak. But the ground is cruel. The anomaly was real, but what it contained did not resolve the central question. Debris. Old materials. A fragment that raised possibilities without delivering answers. The dog's alert could be residual, could be unrelated, could be contamination from some other forgotten history. The team documented everything, collected what they could, and the disappointment settled like dust, because in this case, even a promising moment could collapse into nothing, and each collapse was a reminder that time is not just a distance. It's an eraser. That night, back in their offices, detectives stared at maps and notes and felt the case looming like a living thing. Because the arrest had not ended the work, it had intensified it, and the pressure was now twofold. Prove guilt beyond reasonable doubt, and deliver the truth that the family deserved. They were no longer chasing a ghost. They had a suspect. They had DNA. They had headlines. But they still didn't have her, and the absence of her remained the most powerful silence in the entire story. Somewhere, in a cell or behind legal walls, the suspect lay down at night with the knowledge that the past had finally caught him, and the question was whether that knowledge would break him, whether the weight of exposure would pry loose what decades of secrecy had held tight, whether, at the edge of his own collapse, he might finally trade control for relief, and if he did, whether the truth he offered would be the truth the family needed or just another layer of cruelty. Because cold cases do not end neatly. They end in pieces, in fragments, in partial answers that arrive like shards. And the town, still waking up every morning to the echo of that midnight knock, began to understand that justice is not a single moment of triumph. It is a long, grinding process that forces the living to stare at the dead space where certainty should be, and to keep staring until the dark finally gives something up, or until the people searching run out of time themselves. The first snow of the season came down in thin, hesitant flakes, the kind that melt on contact and leave the ground damp rather than white, and yet the town reacted to it like an omen, because everything had become symbolic now, every weather change, every quiet night, every siren in the distance, all of it folding itself into the same story that refused to end cleanly, the story that headlines insisted was solved while the people living inside it knew better, because solved is a word that looks good on a screen, and unresolved is the word that keeps you awake at 3 in the morning when you realize the most important truth is still missing. Inside the courthouse, the case began to move with the slow, grinding force of machinery, hearings scheduled, motions filed, dates set and reset, and each procedural step felt like a small betrayal to the family, because legal process is patient in a way that pain is not. The defense arrived with polished calm, suits pressed, binders stacked, their strategy already visible in the way they spoke. Controlled, skeptical, always leaning on the spaces where certainty could be questioned. They didn't need to prove innocence. They needed to manufacture doubt, and doubt is easier to grow when the final chapter is still absent, when the victim is still missing, when the story still has no grave to anchor it. The prosecution knew the terrain. They had the DNA match, a hard point in a world of soft memories. But hard points alone don't win trials. Juries don't live in probability. They live in narratives. They live in the human need for a sequence that makes sense, and so the prosecutors began building the case like architects, not just presenting evidence but constructing a structure that could hold the weight of 30 years. They rehearsed how to explain DNA without letting it become abstract, how to make science feel tangible, how to walk 12 strangers through a chain of custody story that began in 1994 and survived every turn of time without breaking. And still, the defense kept pointing to the same absence like a finger pressed into a bruise. No body. No confession. No eyewitness to the act itself. Just contact. Just association. Just a match that proves proximity but not murder. And even though everyone in the room understood how obscene that argument felt, obscenity doesn't matter in court the way it matters in a home, because courtrooms are built to strip emotion away and replace it with standards. Reasonable doubt, burden of proof, admissibility. The defense wanted to turn the family's suffering into a legal advantage, to suggest that investigators were so desperate for closure they'd accepted a single explanation and stopped looking for others, and the prosecution bristled quietly at that, because desperation had not built this case. Patience had. Outside, the town's shock began to sour into something more corrosive. It wasn't just disbelief anymore. It was a paranoia with roots. People started scrutinizing their own histories, not like nostalgic reflection but like forensic review. Old friendships were reevaluated. Old arguments were reinterpreted. People looked at photographs from the 90s and felt a coldness creep up their spines as they realized the suspect's face might have been somewhere in the background, smiling, unremarkable, embedded in their lives without permission. The idea that they had been breathing the same air as a man now accused of swallowing someone's existence made them feel contaminated, as if proximity itself had been a kind of exposure. The suspect's family, if he had one, if there were people still willing to stand near him, became collateral damage in a war they didn't start. Their mailboxes filled with hate. Their cars became targets of judgment. They stopped going to certain stores. They avoided eye contact. Because communities crave someone to blame, and blame doesn't always stop at the person in cuffs. The town wanted to believe evil was isolated, contained, easy to identify. But this case had proven the opposite. It had proven that evil can be domestic, quiet, woven into routine so tightly that it becomes indistinguishable from normal life, and that realization is a trauma all its own. Investigators kept searching because the case still had a hole in it, a void shaped like the victim, and until that void was filled, nothing would feel complete. Not for the family, not for the jury, not for the detectives who had carried the weight of the file from hand to hand for decades. They revisited areas connected to the suspect's past again, not repeating old searches mechanically but refining them, tightening grids, cross-referencing new tips, comparing aerial imagery from 1994 with the present landscape like two transparent sheets layered together. They asked themselves where you would hide something if you had time, if you understood terrain, if you could move without drawing attention. They asked what kind of burial is not a burial at all, what kind of concealment doesn't require digging, only placement, only distance, only the confidence that nature will do the rest. Each new search drew a line of tension through the community. People watched from behind fences. People drove past slowly and stared. Some offered help. Others offered conspiracy. Every time a backhoe arrived, every time a dog handler walked a perimeter, hope rose in the family like reflex, and then immediately collided with fear, because finding her would mean closing a chapter they had lived in for 30 years, and closure, though desired, is still final. Finality is frightening when you've survived on the thin, painful thread of uncertainty for so long. Uncertainty is a cage, but it's a cage you learn to decorate because you have no choice. Freedom, when it comes, can feel like falling. The suspect remained behind his wall of counsel, but pressure has ways of leaking through cracks. Jail is a place where time becomes thick, where silence becomes a companion, where the past has too much room to speak. People who have carried secrets for decades often rely on distractions. Work, routine, family, the steady illusion that they are untouchable. Jail removes those distractions. Jail forces you to live with yourself. And living with yourself can be unbearable when the world finally agrees you are what you have always feared you might be. There were rumors, the kind that ripple through institutions before they reach the public, that he had begun to talk in fragments, not to detectives directly, but to the environment around him, to a counselor, to a chaplain, to another inmate in the way men sometimes confess sideways, as if speaking to someone else allows them to pretend they're not speaking at all. Investigators listened carefully to these whispers but treated them like unstable chemicals, because jailhouse information can be poison, contaminated by incentives, by lies, by people hungry for attention or reduced sentences. Still, they couldn't ignore the possibility that confinement was loosening him, that time, once his ally, had become his enemy. A meeting was arranged through formal channels, cautious, monitored, designed to be admissible if it produced anything real. The suspect sat again under fluorescent light, but this time the light seemed harsher, because now the world knew his name, and shame, even when denied, changes posture. He looked older than he had in the arrest footage, not physically necessarily, but in the way someone looks when the story they've been telling themselves finally collapses. His eyes flicked to the side occasionally, a habit of avoidance, and the detectives spoke in controlled tones, offering him what they always offer at this stage: a chance to stop making it worse. They didn't plead. They didn't threaten theatrically. They presented reality like a concrete block set on the table. The trial was coming. The evidence was coming. The town would hear his name again and again until it became inseparable from the victims. And the question that had survived 30 years, would keep chasing him in every headline, every courtroom whisper, every stare from across a hallway. Where is she? That question would outlive him if he let it. That question would become the final label on his existence. For a moment, he seemed to waver, not breaking down, not confessing, but wavering, like a person standing on a ledge unsure whether to step back or jump. He asked a question that sounded meaningless on its surface, about how the family was doing, about what they were saying, about what the public believed, and detectives recognized it immediately for what it was: a crack. Because guilty people often worry not about truth but about narrative, not about what happened but about what people think happened, and the fact that he was thinking about perception suggested he was still fighting for control. They pushed gently, steering him toward the one thing that could change the entire shape of the case. Location. They told him that he could keep denying the act and still give them that, still return something to the family, still stop the bleeding of uncertainty. They described the mother who had aged waiting. They described the siblings who had built entire lives around a hole. They described the empty chair at holidays, the way absence becomes a ritual. They didn't do it to manipulate. They did it because sometimes, in the right moment, empathy becomes a wedge that pries open a locked door. His jaw worked. He stared at the table. His hands that had once blended into ordinary life, twitched slightly, as if his body wanted to speak before his mouth could allow it. And then he said something that was not a confession, not a clean admission, but a sentence heavy enough to change the atmosphere in the room. Something about a place. Not a precise address, not coordinates, but a reference that could be mapped, that could be pursued. A detail from 1994 that sounded like geography, like terrain, like a memory of movement. Detectives didn't react the way people imagine detectives react. They didn't slam fists. They didn't shout, "Got you." They stayed calm, because calm keeps doors open, and panic shuts them. They asked follow-up questions softly, clarifying without pressing too hard, letting him talk just enough to give shape to the hint. And as the hint grew clearer, the room tightened again with that familiar, painful hope, because hints are dangerous. Hints can lead to truth, or they can lead to another decade of searching. When the meeting ended, investigators moved fast, not with chaos but with purpose, gathering maps, comparing the suspect's words to old records, aligning his reference points with landscapes that had changed since 1994. The place he described, if it was the place, had been open ground then, but development, erosion, and time had rewritten it. That didn't stop them. It only made the search more urgent, because if he was finally leaking truth, it might not leak again. The next morning, before dawn, they were out there, breath visible in the cold, equipment loaded, dogs restless, flags ready to mark grids, and the sky was the color of steel, indifferent to human desperation. The family was not told immediately. Not yet. Not until something solid existed, because hope is fragile and they had already survived too many broken promises. Investigators stepped onto the land with a sensation that felt almost spiritual, as if they were walking into the past itself, and the ground beneath their boots carried the weight of everything unsaid. The dogs moved. The radar scanned. The team worked in silence broken only by instructions and the scrape of tools. And in that slow, methodical motion, Part 10 of the story gathered itself into a single terrifying possibility. That the missing truth, withheld for decades, might finally be close enough to touch, close enough to prove, close enough to end the cruel contradiction of a solved headline and an unsolved wound. But cold cases do not surrender easily. The ground keeps its secrets the way the mind does. And as the search continued under that gray Ohio sky, every person there knew the same thing with bone-deep clarity. If they were wrong, if this lead dissolved into nothing, the case would not just remain unresolved. It would become heavier than ever, because now they had glimpsed the outline of an answer, and losing an answer is a different kind of pain than never having one at all. Dawn never feels clean after a night like that. It feels borrowed, like the morning is only pretending to be normal while everything underneath is still vibrating from what happened in the dark. And out there on that stretch of Ohio ground the air was sharp enough to sting the lungs, the kind of cold that makes metal bite your hands through gloves, the kind of cold that turns every breath into a visible confession. The team moved in deliberate lines, boots pressing into soil that had not asked to become part of a story, flags marking a grid like a battlefield drawn in miniature, and the dogs worked with a solemn intensity that made everyone fall quiet, because when a dog pauses and circles, when its posture changes, it's like the earth is about to speak and you don't want your own voice to drown it out. The suspect's words, those half-sentences, that vague geography, sat inside every investigator's mind like a ticking device. Not a promise, never a promise, but a direction, and direction is dangerous in a case that has survived by starving people of it. They scanned for anomalies, shadows under the surface, disturbances that didn't belong, and every time the equipment chirped or the handler stiffened, Hearts rose and fell in sync like a single organism trying not to break. The landscape had changed since 1994. That was the cruelest part. New growth, altered drainage, patches of ground compacted by years of weather and footsteps and construction somewhere nearby. And time had the audacity to keep rewriting the crime scene as if it were erasing its own guilt. Hours passed the way they always do in searches like this, slow, heavy, measured in inches, because the difference between an empty field and a grave can be the width of your palm. They stopped when the dog alerted, not once, but twice, not frantic, but insistently, and the handler's voice went low, professional, too calm for what everyone felt, and the soil was tested, photographed, documented like ritual, because in cold cases you don't just dig, you build a chain of truth that will survive every future challenge. Shovels came out, then smaller tools, the careful scraping that feels almost reverent, and the sound of metal against earth became the only sound worth hearing. The first thing they found was not the answer the family had lived for, it was just something, the kind of something that can either be meaningless or life-altering depending on what it is, and the moment it surfaced everyone froze because you never know what you're seeing until it's clean, until it's cataloged, until the mind accepts it. A fragment, a trace, not enough for certainty, not enough for closure, but enough to pull the air tight in everyone's chest, because even the possibility of human remains changes the temperature of a case. Forensic specialists stepped in, gloved hands steady, and the object was placed gently, almost tenderly, into evidence packaging as if harshness could damage the truth itself. They did not call the family. Not yet. Not until the lab confirmed. Not until the cruel machinery of science turned ambiguity into fact. Because hope, once offered, becomes a responsibility, and this family had carried too much responsibility already, carrying their own grief, carrying their own unanswered questions, carrying the weight of a community's curiosity and the state's slow patience. So the investigators returned to the station with a new kind of silence, the kind that isn't empty but crowded with the same thought looping in every mind. Please let this be real, and if it is real, please let it be her, because not knowing is a torture, but knowing can be a different kind of torture, a finality that burns. The lab process began again, the familiar choreography of gloves and sterile rooms, and the evidence moved through protocols like a sacred object, each handoff documented, each test planned with the kind of caution reserved for things that can ruin lives if mishandled. Days stretched. The town waited with the attention span of a wound, restless and aching. Reporters sniffed for updates, reading into every official refusal to comment, every no new information at this time. Because silence in a high-profile case is never heard as silence. It's heard as either failure or imminent revelation. In homes across the community, people argued about what the suspect had said, what he might still be hiding, whether he would ever tell the full truth, and those arguments bled into daily life like ink, staining conversations that used to be about weather and sports and work schedules. The victim's family lived inside a suspended moment, not officially informed but not ignorant either, because families develop a sixth sense for shifts in an investigation, and they had been in this battle too long not to feel when something changed. They watched the news. They read between lines. They listened to the tone of voices when officials spoke. Every time a phone rang, the heart jumped and the stomach dropped in the same breath, because the call could mean yes or no or nothing, and all three possibilities carried their own pain. And beneath all of it was a fury that had matured over decades into something steady and durable. The fury that a person could take someone away and then carry the location like a private possession, a secret he could dole out in fragments when it served him, as if the truth belonged to him instead of to the life he stole. In the jail, the suspect became a rumor with a heartbeat, seen only in brief court appearances, escorted through hallways in cuffs, his face caught by cameras that made him look both smaller and more infamous at the same time. The defense maintained its posture, insisting on rights, on procedure, on the presumption of innocence, but no one in the town heard those words neutrally anymore, because DNA had taken away neutrality, and the longer the victim stayed missing, the more those legal protections sounded like obstacles placed between the living and the dead. Prosecutors continued assembling their case with ruthless discipline, building the narrative like a wall, because they knew the defense would try to exploit every gap, would try to turn missing evidence into missing certainty, and they prepared to answer with the only thing strong enough to compete with doubt. Accumulation, context, science, and the undeniable strangeness of a life that disappeared without a sound. And then the lab results returned, not with the cinematic clarity people pray for, but with the reality cold cases often deliver. complicated, partial, enough to intensify the ache rather than soothe it. The fragment was human, but time had been cruel to it, and certainty did not arrive cleanly. It suggested, it hinted, it offered probabilities, not absolutes. It was a door half open, revealing darkness beyond, not the full room. Investigators felt the air leave their bodies in slow disappointment, because the human mind craves a binary outcome. Found or not found, solved or unsolved, and cold cases rarely grant that simplicity. They grant liminal space. They grant not enough. They grant another layer of waiting. They did call the family then, because even partial truth is still truth, and because the family deserved to know that the search was not empty, that the land had yielded something, even if it did not yield everything. The conversation was careful, voices gentle, words chosen like they were stepping around broken glass, and the family's reaction was the kind that never makes good television. Quiet, shaking, the sound of someone trying to breathe while holding 30 years in their chest. Relief didn't arrive as joy. It arrived as exhaustion. It arrived as the sudden realization that closure, if it came, would not feel like victory. It would feel like the end of an endurance test that had reshaped them into different people. The community absorbed the update like a bruise, swelling with new speculation, new hope, new dread. Some clung to the idea that this meant she was close, that the rest would follow, that the suspect would finally break. Others feared the opposite, that this was all they would ever get, a fragment, a whisper from the ground, a confirmation without completion. The phrase solved began to sound bitter in people's mouths, because solved suggested the pain could be filed away, and pain like this does not file. It lingers, it stains, it resurfaces in unexpected places. The truth, at least the full truth, was still not entirely out. The suspect still had silences. The land still held secrets. And the years between 1994 and now were still filled with missing hours no science could reconstruct perfectly. Investigators went back again because partial results are not endings, they are invitations, and they refused to let the invitation fade. They expanded the search zone. They rechecked the grids. They combed the area with a stubbornness that bordered on defiance, because defiance is sometimes the only answer to time. They used every modern tool they could justify, every method designed to defeat concealment, and each day they returned home with dirt under their nails and the same question in their heads. How many miles can a secret travel before it becomes unreachable? How many years can a body stay hidden before the earth itself forgets it? How many times can a family be forced to hope and be disappointed before something breaks permanently? In court, the case marched toward a conclusion that would look like closure to outsiders. The suspect sat, expression controlled, hearing his name tethered to hers again and again, hearing the word DNA spoken like a verdict, and yet the most important sentence still hadn't been spoken aloud, the sentence that begins with where. Prosecutors sought to hold him accountable regardless of what the ground did or didn't surrender, because justice cannot always wait for perfect endings. The family prepared themselves for a trial that would drag them through the past in public, every detail dissected, every memory displayed, because that is the price the system demands for accountability, and the price is always paid by the people who have already lost the most. And in the quiet after each update, after each search, after each court appearance, the town of Ohio sat with a new kind of haunting. Not the haunting of the unknown, but the haunting of the known that still refuses to be complete. They knew now that the danger had been close. They knew now that time does not guarantee safety. They knew now that a person can live an ordinary life while carrying an extraordinary darkness, and that darkness can survive for decades, protected not by brilliance, but by the simple fact that the world moves on unless it is forced not to. Because that midnight knock, so decisive, so final, did not truly end the story. It only proved that the story had been real all along. Proved that the nightmare was not a rumor. It proved that the victim's absence was not an accident of fate but the result of human choice. And it left the community with a final, lingering tension that no headline could resolve. The truth can be discovered, yes, but discovery does not always restore what was taken. Some pieces return as fragments. Some answers arrive with qualifiers. Some wounds close only halfway and leave a scar that never stops aching when the weather changes. So the town keeps listening, even now, to the quiet between updates, the quiet that used to feel safe and now feels loaded, because they have learned the lesson cold cases teach better than anything else. Silence is not proof of peace. Silence is often just time waiting. And somewhere under Ohio soil or inside a locked memory, there is still a final detail, a final fact, a final sentence that would complete the story if it ever surfaced, and until it does, the case remains what it always was beneath every label. A disappearance that turned into a lifetime of questions, a community shocked awake, and an absence so profound it became a presence in every room, every year, every night that falls quiet enough for people to hear the echo of a knock that came too late, and still somehow keeps coming.